Good morning, and thank you for being here, both in person and virtually. I'm John Walters, President and CEO of Hudson Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's conference hosted by Hudson's China Center on the planning for a post-communist China. This volume, which is available here live and in person and available to you online, covers a number of the topics that will be addressed during our panels and others that are pertinent to this particular issue. After 4 decades of unprecedented economic growth and assertive global integration, the PRC faces complex structural changes that cast doubt on the long-term sustainability of the Chinese Communist Party. These include an increasingly uncertain economic outlook, a more hostile international environment, a brittle governance model that can't adapt to challenges due to Xi Jinping's political centralization efforts. While the CCP has dealt with problems in the past, history has shown that in those moments of rapid change, if we are unprepared, we often react too late. This conference is therefore an exercise in strategic foresight, considering the potential collapse of the CCP, designed to examine whether the international community is prepared for this possibility. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Miles Yu, Senior Fellow and Director of Hudson's China Center, to offer remarks and introduce the panels that will cover some of the topics in this volume. I recommend it very highly to all of you. Thank you. Miles?
Thank you, John, for the remarks and opening this the conference. Thank you for coming. And let me say something presidential. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Good morning. My name is Miles Yu, and I'm the director of the China Center here. We're often thinking about China as the number one national security threat to this country, and which is true. And that's the recognition by all political forces across the aisles. So China is a formidable adversary. That's the consensus. But a suddenly collapsed China could also prove to be very formidable as well, because China is a long repressed regime with all kinds of problems and scars and institutional flaws that could be very dangerous to the rest of the world too. So how do we find out a country that suddenly collapsed under over nearly 70 years of communist rule, and that will be sort of peacefully transiting to a more normal country, and that's basically the task that we're thinking about a couple of years ago, as a matter of fact, which resulted in the publication of this report that John indicated earlier. We have to think about the same kind of a formidable task that the world faced after, say, the regime collapse of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and even the collapse of the Soviet communism in Eastern Europe. So in each one of the cases, and we have to think about how to stabilize that regime first, that collapse, post-collapse regime, and how to deal with all kinds of issues, and then secondly, how to transition those societies into a normal sort of members of the international community. So this is basically on a much larger scale, because China is huge. China is also a very complex country. You will see, if in a scenario of a suddenly collapsed regime in China, you would have to deal with, first foremost, I'm thinking about, say, how to prevent ethnic vengeance in places like Tibet and Xinjiang, and how to secure borders, how to secure the nukes and the biolabs, and how do we actually make sure that there will be some kind of truth and reconciliation process in China, because the communist rule of nearly 80 years is full of lies and untruth. How many people were killed during Cultural Revolution? Who died in Tiananmen Square? How many? And what's the true origin of COVID? So there's a lot of stuff we have to uncover. And only through this process that the society can heal its psychological and historical wounds and can move forward. And also, ultimately, of course, how to change a totalitarian regime into a constitutional regime, which is sort of in compliance with the dream of China since the May 4th movement of 1919. That is how to sort of place the premium on Mr. Democracy, De Xianxin, and how to create a sort of constitutional rule in China to make China a nation that will be sort of responsible to its own people, rule with the consent of the people, and also at peace with its neighbors. So this is a very important task, and we're going to talk about. Of course, this is just the beginning of a long process. Hopefully, that we'll think more about what a post-communist China will be like, so that we will have a more sort of a stable and healthy transition to a future of that region, and also for the world. So today's conference, we're going to have two panels. The first part will deal with some of the sort of immediate tasks within, say, a very short period of time after the region's collapse, and security and biolabs, all the things. And the second one is more about the long-term religious issue and constitutional issue and truth and reconciliation. So in your program is the bioinformation of all our speakers. And we'll go basically, we have 7 speakers today, and we have 2 panels, and we'll go, so I'm not going to take much of a time to read the detail of the illustrative bio and careers of each speaker. But we'll go with, first with Mr. Randy Shriver, and then followed by the Gordon, is that right? And then Rick Fisher, Mr. Fisher, and then we're going to go the second panel, which it will be, so it's very interesting because you print 2 sides, so you have to really turn to look at it. Anyway, it's in your program, so I'm going to basically, when the beginning of the second panel starts, I'll read the order in which the speaker will speak, right? First of all, let me turn the podium to Mr. Randy Shriver. Ready?
Good morning, Miles. Thank you very much for having me, and really impressed with this project and look forward to reading the report. This is sort of draft season. We had the Major League Baseball draft 2 days ago, NBA draft a few weeks ago. I'm what is called a player to be named later. I was asked just 2 days ago to pitch in for Chad Sabrasia, who is the real expert on this. But I really want to be part of this conversation. I think it's a conversation that should be much more robust, should involve more analysts and experts. I think for a long time, people wanted to avoid the question. It's too hard, it's too messy, it's too hard to know, maybe it's even a little scary. But I also think people wanted to sidestep this question for a long time for political reasons. If you start talking about post-CCP, that means you don't buy into the notion that the CCP will be in power in perpetuity. And that is quite offensive to the communist leadership in Beijing. So I really am pleased to be a part of this, and glad that Miles did ask me to participate. So I've spent a lot of my career looking at the security forces of China, so I thought I'd focus a bit on that. I think the role of the security forces broadly will be extremely important in virtually any scenario. Part of that is informed by history. There's a very interesting history of the PLA activities during the Cultural Revolution, during Tiananmen, of course, and more recently the People's Armed Police when it comes to domestic stability and security of critical infrastructure and the like. If you haven't read the history of the PLA during the Cultural Revolution, it is quite interesting. They played a role in quelling domestic disturbances when the Red Guards got too out of control. They played a role in protection of nuclear weapons facilities. In some instances, at provincial, local levels, they formed revolutionary governing councils that were entirely PLA because governance had become so difficult. So the PLA role in that post period, if it is chaotic, would be very interesting to understand and unpack a little bit. Partly because of the experience in Tiananmen, where the PLA was used to put down internal unrest, the role of the People's Armed Police has been expanded and they've been better resourced. So the People's Armed Police created in 1982, but really post-Tiananmen 89, extremely robust investment in those forces. They number somewhere 500,000 or north of that when you include reserves, and there's militia that have associations with the People's Armed Police. But of course, they've been the instrument more recently. When you think of the Wuhan village uprisings, 2011, it was People's Armed Police. When you think of Hong Kong, even deployment of People's Armed Police in Guangzhou to the border. So thinking about the role of the People's Armed Police, which is subordinate to the PLA, and that was made clear during reforms of 2018, that they report through the Central Military Commission. All of that will be very important, I think, to understand. When they do deploy for the purposes of dealing with civil unrest, natural disasters, etc., they do think about critical infrastructure protection. They do think about securing these facilities that Miles mentioned in his opening remarks: biolabs, weapons labs, and caches and the like. So I think one could expect that would, and they train on that. So I think one could expect that the security forces would play that kind of role if the collapse and the post-collapse period was quite chaotic. The question is, long term, do they splinter? Do they fracture? What kind of role would they play going forward in a post-communist China? And I think the likelihood is that they don't splinter. There have been efforts during Xi Jinping's era to strengthen centralized control, and of course, at a very personal level, a lot of the purges were designed to have loyalty to the person, but really to the party and the central governing authorities. Partly informed by Tiananmen, where you might recall the security forces, PLA, the original deployment of Beijing area, People's Liberation Army wouldn't fire on the protesters because these were their fellow members of the city and the community, and friends wouldn't fire on friends, kind of thing. So they've done a lot of reforms to prevent splintering and having split loyalties at the provincial level versus the central level. So I think it's quite likely that the PLA and People's Armed Police do hold together, and so the question then is, what kind of role would they play? It seems to me that in the near term, the PLA still has that domestic stability role written into their mission statements and as part of their doctrine. So I suspect they'd be inward focused, supporting domestic stability in whatever transition would be occurring, and I think the likelihood of a diversionary war or something of that like during a period of chaos is unlikely. But we shouldn't forget that this is a military that is essentially from 1996 on built for regional contingencies, Taiwan first and foremost, but other regional contingencies, East China Sea, South China Sea, and it's built to take into account U.S. intervention in those contingencies. So post-96 is really, and the Taiwan Strait crisis and the deployment of 2 U.S. aircraft carriers is really where this notion of anti-access area denial, A2AD, comes about. A2AD being an English term that we've put on the doctrine, but nonetheless, this is a military that has invested heavily. It's quite capable when it comes to operationalizing these regional contingencies, and they very much have us in mind. A lot of their power projection is to deal with U.S. forward-deployed forces or forces that might surge to the area. So as we think about a post-CCP PLA, I think whatever government comes into power is going to inherit a military that is 2 million plus strong when you count reserves, built for power projection, for regional contingencies, really built for taking and seizing and holding Taiwan and dealing with the U.S. intervention in that. So I think that has to be taken into account in our planning, that this is a very capable military that doesn't go away, even if they're inwardly focused and dealing with domestic stability. When we think about potential outside threats, you know, China is, of course, I think it's 14 countries border China, most in the world. At one time or another, they've had difficulty with defining and agreeing on their borders with many of these bordering countries. But there's not an obvious threat to the post-CCP China that would sort of want to come in and occupy parts of China, would want to have a heavy hand in determining the post-CCP government. So I think the notion of an outside threat in this period of transition would be pretty limited. I mean, there might be some opportunism on the Indian border. There might be opportunistic moves related to some of the disputed features in the South China Sea. But certainly it would be a high-risk endeavor to take on China on the Vietnamese border, on the Russian border, even in a period of domestic chaos. This is still a very capable military, still one that has trained for a variety of these contingencies for a long time. So I think really the lens that I would look primarily through is a security force, People's Liberation Army, People's Armed Police, civil local police, militias, that would be focused on domestic stability, that would be focused on securing critical infrastructure, that would have an eye on potential threats, particularly border areas, but really would be looking to ride that transition out to a point where they could reestablish themselves as a regional, if not global power, and regain the initiative to think about how to operationalize these various contingencies. Now, there is a big question hanging out there. The security forces, of course, are pledged, their loyalty is pledged to the party. It is a party army. It is not, they're not taking an oath to a constitution, to a country. It is a party army. So who do they, does that transition easily to post-CCP? I suspect it probably does, because again, I think unlikely prospects of them splintering, of them dividing loyalties among regional, provincial leaders. I suspect they hang together and transition their loyalty and their extraordinary capabilities to whatever that post-CCP government is. And so I do think as the United States, allies, and others look at this as a possibility, our problems don't go away immediately. Our security challenges, certainly in the Indo-Pacific, I think would remain. It would be a matter of politics and diplomacy as to whether or not the threat picture would actually change over time, less so dealing with the PLA unless they themselves were to make decisions about changing focus, reducing size, and I think my friend Rick is going to talk a little bit about that. But thank you again, Miles, for the opportunity to participate, and look forward to the discussion.
And I'll finally, for those, mostly for the benefit of those people watching online, I'm going to basically give you a sense of the order of speakers. So Randy, thank you for those wonderful remarks. And then next speaker will be Gordon Chan, and he's a former counsel to Paul Rice and Shanghai partner, and Baker and McKenzie, Hong Kong. And then follow Gordon will be Rick Fisher, is senior fellow in Asian Military Affairs, International Assessment, and the Strategy Center. And then and that's the first panel. And the second panel was starting around 10:30, and we'll start with Mr. Piero Tazzi, who is the staff director, Congressional Executive Commission on China, and then followed by William Ni. He's the senior manager, Asia Regional Program, National Endowment for Democracy, NED, also known as NED. And then he will be followed by Ms. Nina Xie, who is my colleague here, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. And then the last on the list is Professor Emeritus Don Clark, who is probably the most authoritative voice about Chinese law in this country. So he He's a professor emeritus, George Washington University Law School. So that's the order of speaking. And after each panel, we have a brief discussion of all the speakers. And then so now I turn the podium to Mr. Gordon Chang.
Thank you, Miles, and thank you all for participating today. The question for me is simple to state. What do we do when China collapses? And of course, there's a lot on this to-do list. I'm going to talk about things that we should do, and maybe as important, I'll talk about a few things that we probably shouldn't try to do in the moments after a collapse. Now, there's a lot of things for us to do, as mentioned. I'm going to confine myself to business and financial matters for the most part. And I'm not going to hold you in suspense. So, this is the summary. When China collapses, in other words, when the center is gone, I think that we should start to seize and freeze Chinese assets in our country as fast as we can. In this situation, where we don't know who is running the country, or perhaps nobody's running the country, this is a time when there's going to be chaos. There's going to be chaos in the global and financial markets, which means there's a lot of uncertainty. And it's important for the United States, as the ultimate guarantor of financial security around the world, for us to stabilize things. So, where do we start? I'm going to start with the Chinese banks in the United States. Now, these banks are behemoths. They are the world's largest by almost every metric. And for instance, if we look at assets, a commonly used measuring stick, last year, the 4 largest banks in the world were Chinese. That's no surprise, because that's been the case now for a very long time. Those are what we used to call the Big Four. So, in general, one could sort of think that in a Chinese collapse scenario, maybe these banks just chug along, as usual. But that's pretty unlikely. It's unlikely for a number of reasons. So, first of all, maybe some party in China who's vying for power thinks it's in his or her interest to try to cause turmoil for the rest of the world. Entirely possible. More likely, somebody who's vying for power wants to loot those banks in order to fund his or her ambitions with regard to China. But also, we know something else. And that is, in a collapsing situation, probably business in China starts to stall, it's reduced, and that means that's going to affect the banks as well. Now, Chinese banks are large, but they are also probably insolvent on a balance sheet basis. In other words, the assets that they are showing are probably not worth as much as they are reported. And that's because a lot of the loans that these Chinese banks have extended is using international standards, are probably worthless or next to worthless. Now, whatever the situation is today, we know that the Chinese central government continues to make these banks viable by funding them. So it doesn't really matter. These banks are continuing to continue. But the point is, in a collapse, maybe the central government doesn't provide the liquidity or can't provide the liquidity. And indeed, in a collapse situation, the loan values on the books of these banks are going to fall dramatically. For the reason is that borrowers are not going to be able to continue business in all probability, which means they won't be able to pay back the banks, which means you have further erosion in their balance sheets. So what does the United States do in this situation? Well, it seems to me that the most important thing for us is to seize the assets in the U.S. Now, they're not big players in the U.S., but they do have depositors. And we need to make sure that those depositors are kept whole and that nobody in China is able to loot these banks or otherwise do something that would take away the assets that are available to American depositors. And that means the comptroller of the currency and the FDIC need to move fast. So earlier rather than later would certainly be my policy. We certainly don't want federal regulators to move after the damage has been done. This raises the issue of coordination. Do we coordinate with bank regulators in other countries? And ideally, of course, we would. But in this situation, when we're talking about rapid deterioration in China, probably time is of the essence. And so I would think that we would want to move sooner rather than later, even if that meant no coordination with others. And if we do things that make sense from a bank regulation point of view, I'm sure that bank regulators in other countries will follow our lead. And of course, what I've just said applies to the non-banking financial institutions in our country from China. The other big issue, of course, is the foreign exchange reserves. In April, the U.S. Treasury reported that China was holding $759 billion in American Treasury obligations. The real number is probably higher because it is known that China holds treasuries through nominees in places like London and probably other locations as well. So we're talking about a substantial number. Now, our Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, gave an interview to Bloomberg in April, and this was a time when there was some turmoil in the markets because of President Trump's tariffs, and the Treasury Secretary said, don't worry, foreign companies are not dumping our obligations, and in any event, we have a big toolkit. And of course, that was right. But the point is, when you have a panic, and there will be panic when there's deterioration of the Chinese stability and the political system, then the question is our toolkit big enough? I think here again, we need to start to seize assets and the foreign exchange reserves. And one of the things that we probably need to do is to take a look at the treasuries that are held by nominees in other locations. So I would hope that the Treasury Department would be coordinating with the British authorities and with authorities in known tax havens to look out for disturbing activity, because we don't want some party in China using the foreign exchange reserves to increase volatility around the world. What about food security? Smithfield Foods, biggest pork producer in the United States, owned or generally controlled by Chinese parties. We know that during the COVID epidemic that Smithfield was selling pork to China in circumstances where it looked like it made much more sense to sell to American parties. So we can see that China is using its ownership interest in Smithfield in a way that prejudices the United States. And I think that when there's a crisis in China, we should seize the ownership of Smithfield as well. I don't think that we should have ever allowed Smithfield to be owned by Chinese parties, but right now we don't have the political will to take Smithfield back. But as that famous political theorist, Rahm Emanuel, once said, you never let a good crisis go to waste. And in this particular crisis of the disintegration of the Chinese political system, let's do the things that we need to do. On that topic, President Trump has authority. He has authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. He can even invoke the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. What should he do with those powers? Well, I'd like to see him use that to force American business off of Chinese soil. It's important in a crisis to protect our companies. Our companies are the lifeblood of the American economy. Let's try to make sure that they are not disadvantaged by a political crisis in China. Also, there are evacuations of American citizens who work for those companies. Evacuations are always very difficult. Americans in China have continually ignored State Department advisories about the dangers of being in China. And indeed, in an evacuation, maybe the United States can do something about people who live on China's coastline, but it's certainly going to be very difficult for us to evacuate Americans in the central and western part of the country. Let's try and do something. Why should we try and do something? Well, the case of the two Michaels, the two Canadians who were grabbed in December 2018, is instructive. If you remember, the United States asked the Canadian government to detain Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou because of sanctions violations. The Canadian government did it, and in retaliation, China grabbed the two Michaels. And it just shows a complete disregard in Beijing for its obligations. And of course, this shows that China's willingness to endanger foreigners living on its soil. In a crisis situation, things will obviously be much worse. I'd like to see the President of the United States use his powers to get Americans off Chinese soil as soon as possible. The common thread here is acting fast and seizing Chinese assets when we can. A couple of things we shouldn't do. And here I'm going to diverge a little bit from the business and financial aspects. In a crisis in China, there will inevitably be people in the United States who say that we should try and help one party over another in China because it's in America's interest to do so. And indeed, American presidents have been playing Chinese politics for decades. Yet we have not been very good at that game. And we have seen sometimes some pretty atrocious results where we favor one faction of the Communist Party over another. Especially in a crisis situation in the first 48 hours, maybe first week of the disintegration of the Chinese political system, we definitely should not try and play that game. Related to this, I think that we could very well see an American president say, well, we got to support the Communist Party in this crisis because it's the devil we know. And the idea would be we'd be doing this for stability reasons. Again, this is not something where we have been very good at. For instance, we've had 3 instances where an American president has rescued Chinese communism. Most famous one was 1972. Richard Nixon goes to Beijing in the middle of the Cultural Revolution and saves a Mao Zedong who looked to be in trouble. 1989, George H.W. Bush saves Deng Xiaoping after the Tiananmen massacre. You could even look at 1999, where a period of downturn in China, a period of doubt about the regime, Bill Clinton signs up a World Trade Organization deal to pave China's accession to that organization, which occurred in December 2001, just after his presidency. Now, one could justify what Nixon did. It was the Cold War. Americans felt that we were losing. We needed a friend, yes. But the other 2 instances, no. We rescued a regime that to this day is trying to take down our democracy. So in general, I don't think that we should be trying to play favorites in a Chinese crisis to help a group that may or may not fulfill our wishes. And in any event, throughout history, we haven't been very good at this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Miles. Thank you, Hudson, for helping us to imagine a time in which the executioner's blade of the Chinese Communist Party is not hanging over the whole earth. The last time we faced such a threat, the beginning of my career, in the early 1980s, there were few who would imagine the end of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I came to town expecting I would be working in government, fighting the Soviet Union for a long career. And I share the sentiment of Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense, who in his 96 memoir remarked, and so the greatest of American triumphs, a triumph of constancy, and purpose, sustained over 4 decades at staggering cost, became a peculiarly joyless victory. We had won the Cold War, but there would be no parade. Well, having the Chinese Communist Party, having basically, we hope, vanquished itself, collapsed from within, this is something that we definitely need to celebrate. And as we plan our way forward, we need to take stock of what we avoided. The world that the Chinese Communist Party was building toward, planning for, and ready to execute against all of us. The Chinese Communist Party and its security organs have been for the last 30 years and were building toward a position where they could deploy globally and become the preeminent military power on Earth and in the Earth-Moon system, and even further into dominating our solar system. We see the extent of this preparation, and until the collapse of the party, it was well underway. 13 group armies, combined arms group armies, a navy that was projecting toward well beyond 500 ships, 600 ships, projecting towards 10 carrier battle groups, eventual total nuclear-propelled carrier battle groups, an air force trending toward over 2,000 advanced 4th, 4.5, 5th, and 6th generation fighters, building toward 400 large Y-20 size military transports compared to the Americans, who will never have more than 220. Civilian airliners competing with Boeing and Airbus, and the military variants, very large tankers. A new PLA aerospace force formed basically about 2 years ago, dedicated to control of near space, low Earth orbit, the Earth-Moon system, to Mars and beyond. A People's Armed Police of more than 600,000 troops that would probably be the lead in pacification on Taiwan, pacification of future democracies invaded, the Philippines, the Ryukyu Island chain, and a militia that, according to some Chinese sources, claims at least 8 million personnel and has both maritime and air components. The maritime component, for example, is now building up to a fleet of 80 roll-on, roll-off, pure car truck carriers. These are the huge car carriers that you can see pulling into leaving Baltimore Harbor. 80 of those ships, all at once, can move at least 160,000 troops. That exceeds the troop carriage that we witnessed on D-Day. And they could turn around and in 2 or 3 days do it again if they're assaulting Taiwan or New Zealand, other areas in South Pacific, or onto Latin America, where China has tried to stoke a revival of the Falklands, spent the last 15 years trying to stoke a revival of the Falklands War. All of that power projection, thankfully, is on hiatus because of the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. And the wars that we would have faced. And back in 2013, there was a Chinese internet ditty that was making the rounds. 6 wars China must fight in the next 50 years. Now, it was widely circulated. It was not taken down by the censors, so it had some kind of tacit approval, at least to prepare Chinese opinion for the wars coming, starting with Taiwan and ending with the war to take back lands lost to Russia. Now, of course, 6 is a small number, doesn't yet include the wars that will follow beyond the Asia-Pacific into establishing dominance in the Middle East, securing greater, more intimate political control in Africa, and of course, securing control over Latin America, in addition to the North Pole, the South Pole. This is something that was also put on hiatus by the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. And look, we can chronicle the vast factory that has been established to process Uyghurs in China. Prior to that, Tibetans. And that sector will be available to process Taiwanese, Japanese, Filipinos, and myriad other conquered people. We've seen earlier this year the revelation of the construction of a brand new headquarters, 10 times the size of the Pentagon, the center of the party PLA global hegemony. So first order of business following the collapse of the CCP is to secure the military and to help the new government become secure. What do we do? Well, my suggestion, big taxpayer-funded suggestion, would be to create a Reconstruction Corps, a division, maybe 10,000 trained, language-qualified individuals who could be deployed both to Beijing and throughout the country to serve as advisors and eyes and ears to make sure that the democracies are just as informed about potential threats to the center as that center is engaged to convince it to undertake a path of reform. Additionally, the democracies should also consider what it would take to make sure the party, the PLA, stays in its barracks. Essentially, pay them not to revolt. Now, that's not, of course, a guarantee, but inasmuch as some estimates hold that about 30% of the PLA budget, roughly 70 to 210 billion, works out. We're approaching a temporary subsidy that roughly amounts to what the democracies, Europe and the United States, are giving to Ukraine to fight its war against Russia. Is it something we can afford? Big question, but at least that gives us a ballpark for what we may be facing if we want to exercise that policy tool. And our leverage for deploying these tools will be buy-in by the new government to our great suggestions for how it can relate to the world anew. And I've just made my brief list denouncing hegemonic goals, destruction of democracies, goals of nuclear superiority, territorial claims against neighbors, cyber war, cyber espionage, foregoing hegemony in outer space. Convince the new government can buy into these new directions, then the ability to offer advisors to assist a real transition away from communism, and subsidies to help keep the military in their barracks, on their bases, becomes an attractive exchange. Now, furthermore, restructuring the security sector. In essence, I suggest halving the conventional forces. China will still require a military. Keeping those motivated, intelligent individuals employed in some way it also contributes to stability. The nuclear forces, however, are a particular problem. And here, I would suggest we should be expecting a high level of stability, a requirement for a high number of nuclear weapons in basically a three-way, an attempt to create a three-way balance between Russia, China, and the United States. And that should be balanced, of course, by a three-way pursuit of national missile defenses to essentially cancel out the offensive weapons and strengthen the appeal of negotiated limitations going forward. Space offers a special area for channeling competition in a positive direction. The Chinese space sector is already as advanced as anybody's and is propelled by deep space ambitions. In 2013, their dominant aerospace company announced, we just spent the last 3 years devising a 100-year program to occupy the solar system. That's a commendable ambition. Should the new government buy into transparency in most military realms and transparency in space, then prospects for a positive cooperation with China to the moon, to Mars, and beyond becomes possible. Now, finally, I examine the burden of failure. If we're not able to convince the new government to adopt a positive, non-threatening, non-violent relationship with the Earth and a projection, non-violent projection in space, we will be facing a China motivated by great and dangerous emotions. A potential PLA-controlled China that will redouble the agenda that was put on hold by the collapse of the CCP. So there is a necessity to consider a hedging strategy. What if the collapse leads to something completely negative and totally worse? Then I suggest a sort of minimum force that the democracies should be prepared to gather, starting with about 6,000 American nuclear deployed warheads, 2,000 deployed by Europe, 6,000 theater nuclear warheads, a combined naval force of about 1,200 ships, 20 carrier battle groups, and air forces to support that, and the ability to contest dominance in low Earth orbit, Earth-Moon system, and beyond. It's a burden that I hope we can avoid by quick intervention, engagement with the new leadership, an aggressive effort to convince them to move in a positive direction, to offer minimal supports, to help that along. Because if we fail, it will be a terrible future. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Miles.
Okay, now we're going to have a sort of a general discussion about topics here. And I think, ready, please, yeah. Good to see you. And then if you have time, we have maybe from the audience or some questions. Thank you very much. Three of you bring a very, very unique perspectives on the challenging tasks ahead. In a scenario, I just got a text while I think Rick was speaking. He said, Miles, dream on. You are the only one who's talking about the collapse. How realistic it is. You know, the funny thing is, you know who else is thinking about the regime collapse every day? Is the CCP itself. Every day, it lives in paranoia. Everything they do, every international engagement with the United States is about how fragile the regime is. They want us to not to do that to inspire Chinese people to basically to change the regime. So this is a very serious thing. Totalitarian regime can collapse anytime. They can prolong also as well. So it's not entirely sort of unrealistic in a way if the Communist Party thinks about it all the time, and so should we. Right. Let me go back to the question. You know, in the case of say East Germany, West Germany, when East Germany collapsed, the world expected West Germany would take care of a big chunk of that, sort of stabilizing and transforming the communist regime. And now similarly, you have North Korea, South Korea scenario, right? People would expect South Koreans will take care of a lot of things if the regime collapses in North Korea. In the case of China, you say, oh, yeah, Taiwan, but you know, Taiwan is tiny, small, right? China is big. So the question for you, Randy, is what's Taiwan's role in stabilizing and transforming the Chinese society after the scenario of regime collapse? Should there be some kind of international efforts, like the UN sponsor some enterprises over there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, of course, from 1949, I guess to the present, if you actually read their party platform, the Kuomintang has talked about being the rightful heir to post-imperial China. And so for years they talked about eventual unification once China reformed and all that. But I think that's largely manufactured, and it's a legacy party position. And the phenomena of Taiwanization of Taiwan, which was inevitable when you looked at sort of the composition of Taiwan, how many were actual ethnic mainlanders, how many were indigenous and Taiwanese. So I think the sentiment for being the rightful heir and coming in and helping govern Greater China is a little less than meets the eye. I think Taiwan would likely in fact, go in the other direction. They would explore the possibility of an independent identity, even pushing it even further, and maybe even de jure independence, maybe not on day one, week one, but I think they'd be inclined to go in that direction before they'd go in the direction of this is our problem to solve and we have a role in governing China given our legacy claims. I'm sure Taiwan would have an interest in stability and certainly want to see mainland China come under some control of a responsible governing authority and address the potential threats from that new government. And so is there a role somewhere given language capabilities, given historical affinities among some Taiwanese? Sure, but I think they are likely to see it as not their problem.
Okay, great. Yep. Please.
Yeah, I would just add, this is also a marvelous opportunity today for the United States to make the point that an independent Taiwan is the best thing for a post-communist China. ensuring that it exists as this comprehensive university of how to have transitioned from at least authoritarianism and to conduct a sort of ethnic Chinese pluralistic democracy would be essential for the mainland to make the same transition. And making that point, advancing it, helps to create not only an interest in a transition in China, but also an interest in not going to war against their ethnic relations in Taiwan.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, also the Taiwan experience itself is a very powerful message, right? People say the traditional society cannot really transition to a democracy. Well, Taiwan is traditional Chinese language, Confucian society, and transform into a vibrant democracy, and that's a very powerful message. I think Taiwan's model is probably inspirational as well as material to impact the post-communist scenario. Second question, Gordon, to you. The Chinese population is very resentful of the fact that the Chinese government, the CCP government, has spent tens of billions, even hundreds of billions of dollars on Belt and Road Initiative to develop some projects in other countries, while Chinese population is pretty much in poverty. So you mentioned about all these measures to be taken immediately, freezing Chinese assets, Smithfield, all things. What about the widespread Chinese projects globally, the BRI, Belt and Road Initiatives, all the projects? Would it be nice to just sell them off, get the money to the new government?
Yeah, first of all, you're absolutely right. The Chinese people don't like Belt and Road. And it would seem to me that when you have a Chinese political system disintegrating, there's going to be no support for many of these projects. Remember, what China did was it was building the stuff that the private sector didn't want to touch. In other words, stuff that was economically unviable, which means essentially that these projects will fail once it no longer has support from Beijing. And Beijing has been pulling back support for many of these projects, and they've been a bit left abandoned. So I think we're going to see much more of that. And when Rick talked about the Chinese military, I'm not sure the Chinese people are going to want to have as big a military as it currently has. And you're going to start to see, I think, a lot of these assets start to rust away. Maybe not Soviet style, where they're selling off aircraft carriers, but nonetheless, there's going to be a real pullback in ambitions because the Chinese people say, well, why don't I have good schools and why don't I have this and all the stuff that you've been talking about, Miles? So clearly there's going to be a China which is much smaller footprint in the rest of the world, even if it does have an ability to project power beyond its borders.
Yeah, okay. Rick, I have a question for you. You mentioned about all those measures over there. And now, one thing I found is very interesting is the CCP has a membership of 100 million. What are you going to do with them? Right? You cannot put them all in jail. And so in the, say, for example, in the immediate aftermath of Nazi Germany's demise, we have a denazification program. And in, say, Eastern Europe, people figure out, membership of the Communist Party in places like Czechoslovakia or Poland, who are then actually were sort of informants for the government. So, in other words, there's a very deep soul searching about those people who join the party, and either they are the willing executioners of the party, or they join the party for some other reasons other than ideological. So, how do you solve the problem?
Well, first and foremost, we have to understand that the CCP, like most communist parties, is a secret organization. It does not reveal its membership. You do not talk about party business. Probably the only public aspect of the party that is sort of out there, people know, is you have to pay dues. Pay dues every year. So, from one perspective, Miles, one of the first and most essential measures for the new government to take, if it wants to defend itself from this unprecedented army of 100 million plus, you have to identify them. have to identify them to the world. Personnel files have to be made public to some degree. And this is just the beginning. Clearly, there will be abuses that have to be immediate abuses that have to be confronted. Then the issues of the historical abuses, people who, simply justice for the 60 or 70 million who died under Mao. Who were those people, and what does the new government, what does China owe to them? These are ways in which some measure of an international advisory effort can be very helpful. But this is sort of just the beginning, but it has to be done immediately. Who are the 100 million? Who are they? And what were they responsible for? And what measure of justice do they deserve? That's just the beginning.
Yeah. So I think this will be covered by the second panel. One of the speakers will talk about this. I don't think the membership was that really secret. Remember, during the height of COVID, somebody leaked the entire membership list of a Shanghai Communist Party branch. Hundreds of thousands of them. Mm-hmm. So in other words, getting a membership is not really that easy. Yes, there is some kind of undercover nature of that. Gordon, I have a question for you. The issue about China's finances one of the major issues is the nature of the Chinese currency, renminbi, RMB. It's not internationally convertible. It also sort of a stabilizing factor in the international finance system. What do you deal with the post-communist scenario in terms of Chinese currency?
Well, the Chinese currency, as you point out, is not convertible on the capital account. On the current account, it is supposedly convertible, but in times of crisis, it isn't. And so you have a currency which, Beijing would like it to be more. Today, you have a Beijing that wants it to be more acceptable around the world and more used around the world. But it really isn't for a lot of reasons. And people just don't trust China's management of its own currency. So if you're talking about a crisis situation, I think that, today people will use the renminbi because there are central government plans which are relentlessly implemented to force countries to use renminbi. In a crisis, those plans go away. So you're basically, I think you're going to see a currency which is going to be used even less. Just because people are going to say, oh, that's China. China's a failed state. So therefore, why do we want to hold a currency which we didn't even like in good times? So why are we going to hold it now? And I think you're going to see a lot of that when today you have the Chinese banks. People want to do business with the Chinese banks because it's China. There's going to be less of that as well. So I think we're going to see an implosion in the Chinese banking and financial systems and a currency which is even less used than it is today.
Okay, either implosion or explosion, and either way, is going to be a major issue. You want to say something?
Yes, Miles. Sorry, I just wanted to add a new thought to why you would want exposure. Taking the Commissar Corps of the PLA is public to some extent.
Yeah,
and it'd be very useful to know who those people are. But who are the intelligence organs in the intelligence services, in the police services, the PAP? Knowing who those people are would be almost essential for a post-communist government to assure or begin to build a new level of control.
Yeah. Randy, I have a question for you. Imagine this. In the scenario we're talking about, there might be a huge exodus of human population. So you mentioned that China is a country that has the most landed borders, 14 of them, more than anybody in the world. How do we sort of prevent a massive exodus of the Chinese population cross the border to neighboring countries? Not that is not really justified, but just to to think about how to stabilize the population so that the neighboring countries would not be sort of overfilled with the immigrants. Would there be what would be a corrective measure to prevent that from happening?
I don't know that we can, and I think it would be up to each individual country to secure their own border and deal with potential immigrants. In this case, they would be refugees, or they'd be.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think if you look at other examples, other recent examples, Ukraine, the response of countries like Poland have been quite positive for Ukrainians and the country. So, perhaps there's a way to funnel or channel into the best host country for temporary refugee status. But I don't know that if this is crisis and chaos, and I'm sitting in the National Security Council, I'm not sure on my long list of things to do, preventing Chinese citizens from leaving is very high. I think you'd want some humanitarian effort to ensure they can leave safely and have refuge and temporary status. And that's going to require diplomacy with those border countries. But I think it's going to happen. I think it would likely happen. And there's probably not much we can do to stop it. But can I relate it back to the previous question, too? When you talk about denazification, when you talk about post-imperial Japan, the reality is it was fairly limited, and that most of the institutions remained in place, and most of the people showed up to work on the following Monday as a former Nazi or a formal. And in Japan, it goes all the way to the emperor, right? I mean, we didn't even remove the emperor, right? So I think Rick's comment about transparency is exactly right, but I think when you look at what you do with that information and the extent of purging, we have another example with de-Baathification, which,
That's right.
Disbanding the military, de-Baathification, which I think was a mistake to the extent that we went so deep into the system to remove people. We had a lot of angry, unemployed people, but we also had institutions that couldn't function. And so I think related to, if the PLA is going to play a role in stability and quelling any domestic disturbance, the PLA, the People's Armed Police, would probably also have a role in managing a refugee crisis if it came about. And so I think with the transparency, we have to have some deftness in how we deal with that, or it wouldn't be us, it would be the follow-on government.
I think de-Baathification is probably, the idea is good, but the mistake is to dismantle the Iraqi army and set them loose. And that is, in my view, is the mistake.
Well, I'm not sure it was a good idea, but...
Okay. Go ahead.
Just a related issue on your question is, what is our asylum policy? And the reason why I think about this is because my dad was studying in the United States, got his master's in civil engineering during the Chinese Civil War, and a generous America allowed him to stay. So I'm probably a little bit biased in this. But, the question is, well, what do we do with, let's say, 277,000 Chinese nationals who are students in our universities at this very moment? I mean, what do we do with other Chinese nationals in our country? And that's going to be a really important question, because we don't know if China is going to be a friend or foe. So this just raises all sorts of issues, but it's something that we're going to have to think on day one.
Yeah.
What are we going to do with the Chinese who are here?
That's true. Let's just turn to the audience for any questions. We have a few minutes left. Yeah, please. You, yes.
This whole talk, it's been going on so far, it's been conjecturing that this whole talk that's been going on this morning has been under the basis that this party is collapsing, deteriorating. Right. Is that actually happening now, or is it basically just a theoretical exercise about, what happened if the party collapses? I'm just trying to figure out, or do you have clues or any type that the Chinese government is weakening in some way? I'm just wondering. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. That's a question probably on everybody's mind. We're not exercising how the regime is going to collapse and why it's going to collapse. We're just saying, hey, this is almost like a political war game, right? So you say, what if in the scenario of the regime collapse? Now, you ask a very good question. Are there any impetuses for the regime collapse? As I say, if you look at the Chinese Communist Party, how they conduct their business every day, They live in this paranoid scenario of regime collapse every day. I mean, Zhu Rongji asked everybody to read, Tocqueville's Ancien Regime. I know. And then you look at the Xi Jinping, the way he reacted to Biden, to Trump. There are certain area he's absolutely paranoid about. That is human rights, regime change, all the other issues, right? So because those are the fault lines that the Communist Party worry about every single day. So regime collapse, it sounds very remote from outside, but from within, there are a lot of cracks that could happen. So what we're doing here today is to exercise the possibilities, not reality. Yeah.
Well, Miles, your colleague, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, said the one thing that got the Chinese most upset when he talked to them about a range of issues was when he tried to talk to the Chinese people. And he said this in his July 23, 2020 speech at the Nixon Center, where he said the Chinese just could not deal with him when he was talking about discussing things directly with the Chinese. And so they are very, very insecure in Beijing, as you point out.
Oh, insecure is a nice word. I thought paranoia is probably the better one. Seriously, that even dated earlier in October 2019, when Secretary Pompeo mentioned in one of his speeches, he mentioned very casually, he said, the Chinese people and Chinese Communist Party were totally different concepts. The Chinese went berserk because they fear about people that might change the regime. So what I'm saying is, it is remote, yet it is a possibility. We'll see. All I'm thinking about is that we got to get ready for the contingency.
Thank you so much for that. There's a mic.
Mic here.
Thank you so much for the very insightful conversation and stimulative too. My name is Yuko Mukai, a non-resident fellow, Project 2049. My question is about how, so let's say this scenario happens, what would be the impact, not on the region, but more for the rest of the world? Like, for example, like North Korea, what's going to happen to them, to Japan, US-Japan alliance, and Russia, Iran. And I'm very curious about your analysis on that. Thank you.
Anybody?
How many hours do we have to answer that question? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, you have to take it country by country, but I think North Korea, which at least before its recent arms trades with Russia, was getting 90% of its external trade was with China, and a lot of that was aid. So you could see a North Korean regime start to fail. The North Korean regime starting to fail would probably do something terrible in the region. Russia, would it be able to prosecute the Ukraine war without China's help? I don't think so. Would Iran be able to continue its assault on Israel without China's support? Again, I think we have a much more peaceful world once the Chinese regime is sort of out of the way, as Rick was talking about. So I think the world becomes a lot better place, especially if the United States moves in to reassert stability and control, which we'd have to do, I think. Something we don't want to do, and certainly don't, many people in America don't want to do today. But the world, if we don't do that, could go in very bad directions. And so I think you'll see a much more peaceful world as the U.S. moves in and China moves out.
Yes, we've begun to pointedly ask our allies what they might do in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I think the conversation should be expanded. What will our allies do in the event of a collapse of the Chinese Communist Party?
We'll go this way, and then here.
Yes, good morning. Thank you all for your very insightful remarks. My name is Ian Everhart with the Institute of World Politics. My question is about the role of the internet in all of this, because when the Soviet Empire collapsed, the internet was still in a very primitive state, and very few Soviet subjects had access to the internet. Whereas, I don't know if there's really historical precedent for what would happen when the Great Firewall collapses or is pierced, because the CCP has been lying for the last 100 years. And so it would just be a flood of information. There's already a very active Mandarin ecosystem on the internet. I mean, Dr. Yu regularly gets hundreds of thousands of views when he goes on Taiwanese and other overseas platforms. So what role do you see the internet playing in this regime change situation, and what, if any, preparation what, if any, role does the U.S. government have in this new situation? Thank you.
Well, in any real revolution, the first order from around the table is who's going to go out and seize the means of communication. So any post-CCP order would naturally place that at the top of their to-do list. And assuming they're having done so, then they certainly have choices to make. Do we take down the Great Firewall? Do we let a billion voices flower and the such? And if that indeed happens, then I mean, so much will take care of itself. But having the people on hand that can make clear to the new dispensation that this is something that they must do immediately is a paramount consideration for our side.
Yeah, if you look at Miles' point and the point that's been underscored by others up here about the level of paranoia, you know, they've studied the Arab Spring and the role of social media. They've studied the colored revolutions in Central Asia, and they understand the importance of this, which is why they go to such lengths to control content when it comes to social media, internet-based communications. Now, it's interesting. The way they do it is not to completely clamp down on everything, and you know they target, in particular, anti-Xi Jinping, anti-CCP sentiment. But you know there are all kinds of examples where netizens go crazy over one issue or another, and they sort of let it fester for a while, as long as it's not directed at criticism at them. So there is the potential, if the entity that's controlling for one thing, you know, don't criticize the CCP, is gone, then it could be sort of a free-for-all, and it would be really contingent upon a new government to get a hold of that in some sense. But I also think, in terms of preparing, all the things that Rick said we should be doing, that Gordon said we should be doing, we better have a social media strategy to promote those things. You know, the Chinese citizens are very sophisticated consumers of propaganda and of messaging from the CCP, so much so that in fact they often believe the rumor before they believe what their government is putting out in a crisis, whether that be natural disaster or whatever. So we better be in that space. And I don't necessarily want to bring current events into this question, but I think we are pulling back on some of the tools that would be helpful to us in shaping that before the crisis, but really critically important after the crisis and the chaos.
To follow on that thread, which is excellent, you know, internet is a very powerful tool. It could be a tool of repression and chaos. It could also be a tool of peace and stability. So in other words, you know, in the case scenario we're talking about, there could be some kind of rumors going on and to destabilize the situation. So it's very important to have a voice of truth from somewhere, some central authority. Say, hey, listen, there's no American black hands here and there. There's no sort of food crisis here and there. So there must be some kind of truth to calm down the soul in the scenario of a collapse. Because then you have you might have a lot of displaced population and who basically would have no aim but to create chaos. Yeah. Oh, one question.
Thank you. I'm Uyghur, so therefore I'm very interested to know what will happen to the ethnic minorities like Uyghurs and Tibetans in such a scenario, and what they should do, and what would be the policy or attitude of the new regime, which after post-communist would be toward the Uyghurs.
Yeah, so I think that question will be reserved for the next panel, so which will be dedicated to issues like that, right? So, but thank you for the question. Okay, lady next to it.
Hi, thank you again for the panel. I'm Grace Drexel from the Congressional Executive Commission on China. And I was wondering, is it really possible for the U.S. to not pick winners and stay out, especially with such large interest, like business interest in China? Like, for example, if a faction takes control of Foxconn area, then can U.S. business, for its business interests, really be like, okay, I don't care if you lose, for example?
I think Gordon has a question for you.
Yeah, I don't think that in an ideal world, we would be able to try to shape events in China, especially in a chaotic situation. But in the real world, I'm not sure that we have the ability to do that. And in a situation where we don't have information, China right now is closing up. Xi Jinping has been shutting down the doors. But especially if the political situation, the political system is disintegrating, we'd have even less information. And so I'm afraid that whatever we would try to do would not be on the basis of knowing what the situation is, and we could make things worse, which is the reason why my approach is, let's try and protect our businesses. Let's try to protect American citizens in China, but let's not try to interfere in it until, things calm down. Because then, and only then, will we have the ability to assess the situation and to make reasonable choices, which is the reason why I say, in the first stage of this, we should try and stay out. And I know it's controversial, but the point is, we should only try to do what we have the power to do. And in this situation, I don't think we have that ability.
Okay, we have time for one question, and we'll go to you.
Thank you all the panelists for being here. My name is Tony. I'm an undergraduate at Wisconsin-Madison. I have a specific question not towards our allies, but towards our adversaries in the region with specific respect to Russia and North Korea. A weakened China or a collapsed CCP would most likely mean that these foreign adversaries of the United States would try to gain a foothold or influence into the Chinese society, no matter if it's culturally, socially, or economically. And what I want to know is, what could the United States do in an event like this to prevent foreign adversaries to gain a foothold to try to influence China? Thank you.
Randy, I think that's for you.
Oh, is it? Yeah. That's a hard one. If this happened today, we have a lot of different problems with Mr. Putin. We have no communications with Kim Jong-un. So being able to be, very deft and nuanced in how we reposition those relationships so that they don't try to exercise undue influence in China or try to take advantage. It would be very, very difficult. I think over time, I would be a little more optimistic about North Korea, because the North Koreans don't like the Chinese. And, the alliance notwithstanding, the lips and teeth alliance notwithstanding, it's not by choice, it's by necessity that they've developed this relationship with China. They don't have a lot of power, so in the event of a collapse of China, I'm not sure there's any sort of active role they'd play, but I would certainly be looking for opportunities to really kind of further separate them. In the event a successor government in China is hostile to us, I think there are opportunities to drive a wedge in North Korea. With Russia, all those wedges are there, all those historical legacies are there. If it happened tomorrow, I wouldn't be very optimistic given our relationship with Mr. Putin, which even President Trump seems to be turning on at the moment. But we've sort of got these big fish to fry, and it would be difficult to have a constructive conversation. Down the road, maybe. There's all these fantasies out there about playing the Russia card against China. I don't put a lot of stock in it, but down the road, if there's a collapse in China, maybe.
Just one thing. The border between Korea and China has moved hundreds of miles in both directions over the course of more than half a millennia. And in the situation you talk about, if the PLA is internally focused, You know, it's not inconceivable that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea decides it's time to take back some of that land. Because remember, on the Chinese side of that border, there are ethnic Koreans. And they're ethnic Koreans not because they moved to China, but it's because the border changed. And I'm sure that that's in the minds of people in Pyongyang, as well as Seoul.
Okay, that's all the time we have for this panel. Thank you, Randy, Gordon, and Rick. So as our next panel is being mic'd up, so we'll take a 5-minute recess. All right, thank you. Justice and Constitutional Convention. So our first speaker will be Mr. Tazi, followed by Mr. Ni, and then following Mr. Ni will be Nina Shea, and then the last speaker is Don Clark. All right, so the podium is yours, Piero.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Miles. And I'm going to be talking about dismantling the tools of repression, and that includes the surveillance state, the dossier system, social credit system, and the hukou system as well. So one thing, of course, I'll have to do is address what these are. But if there's a certain theme, I think, to my remarks, it's that past is prologue, both in terms of understanding what the present system is, but also what to expect. I think to begin with, it's very important to understand that this is a totalitarian system that's designed to perpetuate the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And oftentimes we hear the use of the word authoritarianism to describe China, but I think there's an important distinction. And as we look at the mechanisms of the surveillance state, I think that distinction comes into focus. An authoritarian system is one where if you oppose the government, you are beaten, jailed, repressed. But generally, there's a space for business, for religious worship. A ready distinction might be, for the most part, Taiwan under the Kuomintang during the martial law period, where you did have other avenues. Whereas a totalitarian system seeks to dominate the totality of society, and that's the context in which these instruments of repression. Past being prologue. Let's talk about the hukou Zherdu system first. That's household registration, and the present origins began in 1958 during the Maoist period, and it really would tie people to a place and that rural-urban distinction. It controlled internal migration, and it was really to the detriment and disadvantage of the vast majority of rural Chinese. That has changed. I mean, as certainly as China entered the reform era and it became the world's factory, you had mass migrations there. But people who don't have a hukou from a particular municipality are still at a disadvantage. And again, there has been reforms, especially if, the golden ticket, to use a Willy Wonka term, is Beijing or Shanghai, these cities. And if you do have a hukou that ties you to these great urban centers, you have educational opportunities, you have work opportunities that otherwise are denied to people. We're going to talk about ideological reliability too, and how that fits in. But really, I think, again, past is prologue. The roots really go deeper to the hukou system. If you want to go back to the Western Zhou dynasty, 11th, 8th century, you start to see the roots there, certainly as you enter the Warring States period, where there was a need for defensive reasons, communal defense. You had organization of households, but it really, I think, comes to the fore in the Qin dynasty. And there was a need to control population, mass mobilization for these corvée labor projects, and conscription. This Qin state was a highly militarized state, and it was based on a philosophy called legalism, fa jia. And Chinese legalism it's a proto-totalitarian theory. If you read Han Feizi, the great legalist theoretician, or if you look at Shangyang, the reformer, the idea of local surveillance, collective responsibility, and punishment, that really comes to the fore. And I think to understand the PRC today, in some ways, yes, it is Marxist, it is Leninist, it is Maoist, it is Shiist, but these are in many ways things that have been glommed onto this legalist strain, this legalist tradition there. I think that if you look at people like Wang Huning, who's a very important figure in the Chinese Communist Party, in part because he's a survivor. He advised Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. In some ways, you know, he is. You see him more as a legalist and someone who questions Marxism's compatibility with China. That is not to downplay or too much at least, the role of Marxist and especially Leninist ideology. The Chinese Communist Party is a Leninist system, Leninist party. I think one more recent commentator, Stephen Kotkin, talks about that. He is interesting because he understands the Soviet Union. I don't know if people are familiar with his biography of Stalin's 2 of 3 volumes that have come out. I don't know if he's fully understands China as much, but that lens by which to look at the Leninist one is very interesting. So we see this continuity from these kind of legalist ideas: collective responsibility, punishment, manageable clusters, population tracking. These, I think, are means of control that do have their roots in this legalist tradition. Mass mobilization, we talked about the Qin dynasty as needing to mobilize people, to militarize them. You know, Mao was very good with that mass line, the ideological mobilization towards a common goal. Today, though, Xi Jinping certainly doesn't have that charisma of Mao Zedong, and we don't see that ideological fervor. That is not something that's characteristic of the reform era, or now the Xi era, which I think is in many ways characterized by certain non-movements, or such as the laying flat, Tanping, or let it rot, Bailan. Xi Jinping wants that great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, the China dream, and a lot of the responses met. So how do you control the masses in that scenario? And that's where technology, facial recognition, social credit system exists. There's a focus on what Pei Min-shi calls ex ante or preventive repression. His book, The Sentinel State, Surveillance and the Survival of Dictatorship in China, is useful. There's this idea of fangkong, prevention and control, that you especially saw during the COVID period. Zhao Kezhi, the Minister of Public Security in 2019, said the prevention of political risk is the first priority. Now, this system is a way to think of it, I think, is multi-layered. It's both horizontal, it's vertical. It exists as a bureaucracy. It's not, but not one that's entirely centralized. It is diffused. You do have neighborhood monitors. You do have now a credit monitoring system. You do see certain things like what is it, Zhima, the sesame, as an open sesame, too, that credit payment system that is integrated in some ways with this social credit score. You have political and legal affairs departments throughout the bureaucracy at different levels. You know, the number of uniformed police in China is relatively small, and even, you know, Rick Fisher, you talked about the Ministry of Public Security. I think you mentioned 1.2 million people there. If you look at East Germany and the Stasi there as a measure of comparison, which was, I think, 91,000, the equivalent in terms of population would be maybe 8 million in China. So it is relatively a smaller people, you know, police presence, and that is because it is diffused. Again, it's at the oftentimes the neighborhood level, the reliance on informers, and it is also, I think, the reliance on technology. Two very important technology systems. One is Skynet, Tianwang. That is the Ministry of Public Security again. Police can tap into it. It's more urban focused. And then the other is Sharp Eyes or Bright Snow, Xueliang Gongzheng, and that also incorporates things such as facial recognition, even gate recognition, how you walk, and that's more focused on the countryside. There's an exportation of this to other countries, authoritarian countries. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and it's often under the guise of these smart city or safe city programs. So that is another challenge. You have the monitoring of WeChat and also what's posted on the internet. The Chinese are very adept at trying to get around that. People might be familiar with Winnie the Pooh references, so you got to clap down at that. It's a little bit like whack-a-mole there too, because Me Too, the Me Too movement, that was censored, so people would start to like uncooked rice, and then like a rabbit, tuza, there, and that would be, and then the authorities are trying to catch on and try to censor these things. The social governance objectives, 社会治理, you have, I think, a lot of that came into its own during COVID and the COVID outbreak there. That was, really, I think, put on stilts in terms of controlling the population. The dossier system. This is something that is very ideological. Your background, your family background, your political background is all kept track of. And there's a kind of a whiff of Maoism here. The idea of the class background, are you red, are you black? Red is good. Black is bad if you came from a landowner family or whatever. And it even goes back to the imperial period, that multi-generation idea of punishment as well. One interesting aside, people may have seen that it was, I think, during the COVID period, there was a video that went viral. A police officer was beating a protester and says, "You're going to be punished for 3 generations." And the response was, 3 generations, we are the last generation. And that goes to that idea of kind of laying flat in Tanping. How do you motivate a people who are opting out? And that goes to sort of, I think, the idea of society and kind of its brittleness there. But this idea of also, we see this idea of collective punishment. One thing very interesting about your social credit score, if you are connected with kind of people that have bad social credit, your social credit goes down. So you see a lot of defriending there too, and you can become sort of an outcast that way and lose friends. What does that do to social trust, to social bonds? Again, I think a lot of these ideas, particularly collective punishment, it is this legalist idea. Legalism, not just punishments, but also rewards. Han Feize, the ruler who uses law must rely on punishment for those who violate it and reward those who follow it. This, of course, has led to this mindset, has led to a lot of social tensions. We see right now, again, post-COVID, especially with the economy, we see these bicyclists in Hunan, we see in Shandong veterans protesting there, and there's this, this concern over the economy. So this idea of stability is being stressed. So that brings us to that what-if scenario after the fall of the CCP. We oftentimes think in Western terms, transitional justice. You look at Cambodia in 1993, how these kind of the Western human rights legal industrial complex, stood to make a lot of money and whatnot there. That's not going to happen in China. China is a great country. What I think you will see, though, is looking back on the resources in the Chinese tradition. If the Qin dynasty was legalist, and it was really the only legalist dynasty per se, the one that really adopted legalism, what followed the Qin? What followed the Qin in terms of dynasty? Anyone? Bueller? The Han. Thank you, Mr. Ni, who's not Chinese, but yes, the Han dynasty followed that. And the Han dynasty rejected legalism. The justification for regime change, the loss of the mandate of heaven, was in Confucian Mencian terms. Liu Bang, the emperor, it was a rejection, overt rejection of legalism. Now, cynics will point out that legalism always was retained, even under Confucian regimes, that the idea of Confucian on the outside, but legalist on the inside, yes, and in many ways, Confucianism sort of served like Christianity did post-Constantine or post-Theodosius. It gave legitimacy to a regime, but they also still retained certain legalist elements. Even the current regime often uses Confucian garb in which to clothe itself. For example, Confucius Institutes, or this silly television show when Marx met Confucius. But it is not a Confucian one. And Confucianism did ameliorate the situation in China. And in the post-Qin, the Han restoration, or it did ameliorate some of the worst aspects of legalism. Punishment was loosened. The idea of collective punishment was loosened. And I think also you saw the rise of localism as opposed to that legalist Qin centralization. The emphasis on moral education. In many ways, the Confucian ideal is lawlessness. Not lawlessness in the sense of anarchy, but the idea of virtue. If you have a virtuous society, if the emperor is virtuous, if society is virtuous, you don't need the laws. Tacitus remarked that a superabundance of law is a sure sign of a civilization in decay. And when you think about that, I think that's very much true. So I think, and just to kind of illustrate the difference between a Confucian mindset and a legalist mindset, both Han Feize and Confucius tell the story of a man named Honest Kung. Honest Kung was so honest that he turned his father in for stealing a sheep. Now, if Han Feize, the legalist, what does he say about Honest Kung? Good guy, bad guy? He's a model citizen. He could be a model Maoist here. I mean, he turned in his own father. What does Confucius say about him? He's the worst kind of human being that there could be. To turn on your own father, never go against the family. It's a lesson from The Godfather, but it is true in Confucian terms as well. So I think what we will see, if we do see a collapse there, one of the sort of the mechanisms that you will see is a more of a localization, and will you see the emergence of sort of a Confucian constitutionalism? During the Reform era, there was talk about that. Jiang Qing, not that Jiang Qing, a different Jiang Qing, wrote a book, Confucian Constitutionalism. There was that movement. I think Taiwan, in many ways, can be an example there. The Republic of China Constitution, dating back to 1912 and then the 1947 reform, has a five-branch system. Two branches that are different from ours are the examination system and the control, or the examination yuan and the control yuan. That, I think, the conscious idea was to hearken back to a Chinese constitutionalism that existed even during the imperial periods. The examination referred to the scholarly elites that were versed in the Confucian classics. The control yuan, or the idea of control, was the idea of a bureaucracy that checked the excesses of the emperor. The idea of remonstrance that existed, that understanding of virtue, that law above the law that was appealed to even in the Chinese system. So I think you might see something that is more indigenous there too. The ROC influence, right now Lai Ching-te is giving 10 speeches on 10 topics. He's talking about human rights, he's talking about democracy, sovereignty. Yes, obviously directed at a local Taiwanese audience, but if you read the Global Times, they're really freaking out about it too, because that message does seep through. You will, of course, have Western liberal ideas somewhat creeping in, but the Western ideas aren't necessarily going to be liberal. So, for example, if you two popular thinkers in China, Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss, critics of liberalism. It'll be interesting to see kind of what emerges, and then I think also this idea of localism and that we think of China as a entity that is unified, but there is this idea of 反就比和和就比分, the opening line of the Three Kingdoms. The realm long divided must unite, long united must divide. You will probably see more in certain regions such as Guangdong, the Hong Kong influence, perhaps an emergence of more liberal regimes. You might see truth and reconciliation committees there. You will probably see then a uneven dismantling of all these systems. But again, I think the past is prologue. You will see a emergence of a sort of modified form of Confucianism, a moving away from these instruments of totalitarian control, but it will be uneven depending on where you are. Thank you very much. And
okay, William.
Well, first of all, thanks for Hudson for having me, and Miles and Colin in particular. And let me just say that I'm giving these remarks not in my NED capacity, just in my personal capacity. And that's partially because the more I thought about the topic of transnational justice, the more daunting it became. So I'm just kind of going to go over a few of the challenges and problems, and then also talk about a few of the advantages that China may have and how we can potentially build on some of those strengths. Obviously, there's a lot to pull on and look at in the international community and the experience. There have been truth commissions of some sort or another in Guatemala, Morocco, the Philippines, Chad, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, Nepal, El Salvador, Ireland, and so on. And of course, also in the post-communist space, and particularly in the post-Soviet states, where it may be more, because of the Leninist system, more useful for China to draw on. But I think of an experience I had about 10 years ago. I was with some Chinese human rights lawyers, and they were looking at cases of injustice. And we had an American who was talking about taking on cases of injustice and using DNA evidence to challenge these cases. And I thought it was a wonderful session after a whole day workshop. But these Chinese lawyers felt that this was inappropriate for the Chinese situation and that their particular situation, their particular institutions deserved its own model. And I think that that's partially the case. And so that's to some extent the case because of the challenges, including, number one, the very long history of the CCP. So we have some of the very well-known human rights abuses, atrocities that have taken place. Obviously, we think of things like the Great Leap Forward, 30 million deaths at least, the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen Massacre, the crimes against humanity that are still ongoing in the Uyghur region. These are some of the things we first think of. But then there are a whole series of lesser-known ones. The Yan'an Rectification Campaign, the Siege of Changchun, the suppression of counter-revolutionaries, which 500,000 to 1 to 2 million people died in the early 50s. The anti-rightist movement, the Tibetan uprising, the Cultural Revolution as it impacted people in southern Mongolia, the things like the July 5th, 2009 massacre in Urumqi, the suppression of Falun Gong and organ harvesting. And then there are crackdowns that are even nonviolent in nature, such as the crackdowns on civil society, against the workers' rights movement, the 709 crackdown on lawyers, which took place about 10 years ago, July 9th, 2015. We're celebrating the 10th anniversary of that. And then if we look at Hong Kong, since 2020 with the national security law. So these are just a huge amount of disasters. And that doesn't even take into consideration issues of economic, social, and cultural rights violations, where we see lots of petitioners continuing going to Beijing to get some form of redress. So there's the question of where do we begin? There's also another challenge of there's a lack of a strong opposition right now. So in looking at the post-communist, the transitions in post-communist states, some scholars have found that the scope and pace of reckoning were strongly linked to the relationship between the regime and the opposition during communism and in the post-communism phase. So after surveying many countries, scholars have came to the conclusion that in areas such as lustration, which is kind of vetting for regime participants, court proceedings, and access to secret files, scholars concluded that there was a clear pattern that the former communists would vote against the reckoning, while the opposition provided the impetus for it. So in other words, where there's a strong opposition, there's the strong impetus for a reckoning. By contrast, where organized opposition towards communism was weak because of a combination of little pre-communist experience with political pluralism, or because of severe repression of any nascent counter-elite, one finds a much weaker push towards transnational justice. So that's another issue that China faces. I would say right now, at least in terms of China domestically, there is no real organized opposition. There's no figure like Navalny, for example. And at least in most people's lived memory, there's not a lot of experience with political pluralism. Another problem one could foresee potentially is that there's a history in which each dynasty, as it takes over, will paint the previous dynasty in a negative light. And one could imagine a scenario in which, if the CCP were to fall, there would be a very superficial reckoning with the past, or very perfunctory reckoning. And there's also a risk, I believe, of a focus on retributive justice without having a social transformation to really change society towards a more democratic society. As Piero was saying, it's kind of if you say a totalitarian or all-encompassing controlling regime, we need to have some sort of similar mechanism to get towards a more democratic society. So those are some of the challenges, and I'm sure there are many, many more that I have not even thought of. But some of the advantages I could see that we could build on are there's a deep respect for history in Chinese culture, obviously. Almost like a religious-like devotion to the importance of history. And this is one reason why, President Xi Jinping has been on guard as what it brands historical nihilism and any looking into the inquiry of the party and attempts to overthrow the Communist Party. But could we use that emphasis on history to do something like Chile did, where there were committees, high-level committees, to assess the human rights violations? We could also, similarly, in addition to having a high-level committee, perhaps have other commissions at a local level to address the issues of the size of China, but also the political differences in repression that took place. So the repression that takes place in Henan or Shandong is very different than places that, like the Tibet Autonomous Region or the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So there may be a need for having different historical or different regional commissions. Another advantage that there is actually is civil society has made excellent efforts over time at human rights documentation. So some of these to think about are the Uyghur Tribunal, which convened a series of experts to look at the issues of crimes against humanity and genocide in the Uyghur region that pulled evidence from many reputable sources. There's things like the Xinjiang Victims Database that has thousands and thousands of victims and their detailed testimonies, and the Uyghur Transitional Justice Database. There was the China Tribunal on forced organ harvesting. Organizations like Human Rights in China have documented in great detail the stories of the mothers and fathers whose sons and daughters were victims of the Tiananmen massacre. The CHRD, the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders, has a database on prisoners of conscience. There are groups to dialogue with, such as the Tiananmen Mothers, the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements in China, which used to put on the vigil every year in Hong Kong for Tiananmen Square. Civil society has also been very adept at using the UN system. Now, why would that matter? Some may be skeptical of the UN, but these are human rights treaties that the Chinese government itself has ratified and agreed to implement. And since 2018 alone, there have been 126 letters and communications from UN special procedures, that's special rapporteurs who are experts or their working groups. So these have involved the gathering of evidence, asking the Chinese government for their response, and the finding of documentation. So this is a very powerful tool in terms of documentation. And civil society is also very useful in forming alliances. There are many informal gatherings and dialogues between Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, mainlanders, and so there's some degree of solidarity and work that can be drawn on there. And I would also say that China has a great tradition of civil society historians. If one looks at Ian Johnson's recent book, we can see that there's many people who have made it their mission to document things on kind of the local level. And Hong Kong, of course, used to have a very vibrant publishing industry in which people like Zhao Ziyang would even write his autobiography to get his point of view of how things occurred in very important moments in Chinese history. And finally, I will say that we can make use of China's religious communities. And maybe this isn't something that people would normally think of, but they have a deep commitment to their communities, and in many cases, an emphasis on restorative justice. If one thinks of even like Pastor Wang Yi, who is talking about repenting and caring for the souls of the people who are persecuting him. Well, could these religious communities be something to potentially engage in dialogue with in a post-communist society? Perhaps we could draw on that. Obviously, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, has set forth a path of dialogue. Furthermore, there are intellectuals such as Ilham Tohti, who had spent their whole lives, their careers, trying to build dialogue and understanding. He's in prison, but hopefully someone like that could also be used in a post-communist society to bring about transitional justice. And I think a final takeaway is, I really appreciated some of the first session talks to hear about some of the disaster scenario planning and the contingencies there. But maybe there's even the possibility of another scenario where we talk about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, Xi Jinping's main tagline that he's always promoting. But can this only be done through fear, through the coercive measures of the security state and power projection? Or, as Piero was perhaps saying, could Chinese people want to say that we want greatness, but based on morality and virtue? And could someone try to eventually lead the country towards something that they can be proud of their cultural heritage? Currently, it's not really the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's not compatible with denying freedom of religion, having Uyghurs in concentration camps or in prisons where we have no idea if they even had a lawyer of their choice, and for controlling the internet. This is not a way towards greatness. So true greatness will require this kind of transition. And so I hope that some of these ideas, having a historical commission and to look at the truth, and then also having provincial and local bodies to engage in dialogue with civil society, with religious leaders, and with the common people could be some of the paths towards a new future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miles. So when the Chinese communist rule collapses, the United States will need to lead an effort to head off ethnic violence and political retribution and civil war. To put the Chinese society on a stable footing for the future, the U.S. policies will be critical to advance independence, democracy, freedom of speech and religion, and other fundamental human rights. And this priority is going to be my focus. It serves American interests by encouraging an orderly transition toward a stable China at peace with its own people, including its minorities and its neighbors. And I will be drawing upon, or I have drawn upon various historical precedents, including the sudden collapse of Soviet communism that ended the Cold War without a shot fired. Its first stages saw the liberation of millions of captive people who formed 20 new republics in Central and Eastern Europe, which have largely gravitated to the West in what historians consider to be a mostly peaceful transition. And that is our goal for China. In China, the undertaking will require varied policies calibrated to the needs of each region, locale, and demographic of that diverse country. I will discuss three broad categories of challenges the U.S. needs to prepare for. First, determining the future political status of the special administrative region of Hong Kong and the 5 autonomous regions of Guangxi, Xinjiang, Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and Ningxia. By law, the CCP allows these regions a degree of self-governance and ability to legislate, but which in practice, of course, is curtailed. Together, these regions represent some 118 million people and include the homelands of China's most oppressed and thus aggrieved ethnic minorities. The regions will each face the decision of whether to remain in China with reinforced autonomy or to separate and declare itself an independent sovereign state. Some may also consider unifying with neighboring states. The U.S., working with its Indo-Pacific allies, should be prepared to support and advise them. Our support for independence should depend on the will of the people of the province, various regional factors, and conditions that U.S. policymakers define in a set of guidelines reflecting U.S. government interests. And first, the first step, the United States government should adopt a set of principles or guidelines to form an interagency task force to coordinate this effort. Principles that the President George H.W. Bush administration adopted on the eve of the Soviet Union's dissolution provides a solid basis. If followed, the new republics could expect U.S. cooperation and assistance. These 5 guiding principles were, first, self-determination consistent with democratic principles, recognition of existing borders, support for democracy and rule of law, preservation of human rights and the rights of national minorities, and finally, respect for international law and obligations. The U.S. should take the lead in weighing whether secession is a viable option for each autonomous region on a case-by-case basis and in consultation with regional leaders and neighboring powers. In some cases, Washington may determine that secession is unrealistic. For example, an unresolved border dispute exists with a neighboring country, in which case the U.S. should make clear its opposition. These states will go ahead anyhow, as we've seen in the past, but they will not get U.S. assistance. Critically, the U.S. quickly recognized the newly declared states of Eastern and Central Europe in 1989 and 1990 and exchanged diplomats with them. By mid-1990, democratically elected governments had replaced all of the former communist regimes of Eastern Europe. In Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, newly created center-right parties formed these governments. It is noteworthy that some of the new democratically elected leaders, such as in Bulgaria and Romania, were reformed, that's a key word there, were reformed communists who emerged from the Communist Party, and the US did not hesitate to recognize them as legitimate as well. Due to the fast-moving events at the end of the Cold War, democratic voting to choose leaders of the new government sometimes came months after the United States showed political support for the new de facto leaders. For example, with the large peaceful protest movements called the Velvet Revolution gaining momentum in Prague through November 1989, Czechoslovakia's communist government resigned in December, and the longtime communist president, before resigning himself, appointed political dissident Václav Havel as the new president to replace him, which the Communist Party-dominated rubber stamp parliament unanimously approved. President Havel came to Washington for an official working visit 3 months later, and he was invited to then address a joint meeting of Congress. It was not until June 1990, 6 months after the former president appointed him, that Czech citizens finally voted Havel into the presidency through free democratic elections that established a new parliament. Another possible scenario is that one or more Chinese provinces may seek to merge with a neighboring country. And I'm thinking of Inner Mongolia with the Republic of Mongolia, for example, or Hong Kong and Guangdong, or Fujian with Taiwan. The United States should give this careful consideration should arise, keeping in mind the unique circumstances that allowed the reunification of East and West Germany. In November '89, the US acted quickly in investing heavily in areas of diplomacy, trade, and defense to support West Germany. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who unexpectedly announced in November '89 a program for free elections in East Germany and a path for reunification with West Germany. So to sum this up, 1, the US should be prepared with guidelines for independence, which must be widely disseminated, similar to the ones used at the Soviet breakup. US support is conditioned on acceptance of these guidelines by the newly emerging states. 2, the US should make a preliminary determination whether independence would serve American interests before pledging our support. 3, the US should expect that all 5 of China's autonomous regions and Hong Kong to choose independence. A Han majority in a minority area or strong CCP control in a particular region does not preclude a vote for independence, as we saw in the Soviet Empire breakup. Skilled US diplomacy will be needed to renegotiate more robust autonomy guarantees for any autonomous region that remains in China. The US, together with its allies, should be prepared to provide expert advice, logistical help, and validation of the outcome in free and fair referendums. The US should quickly recognize the new sovereign states and establish diplomatic relations with them. It should help them gain acceptance from what remains of China and from the world. It should facilitate any mergers involving new states and in resolving border disputes, especially those concerning the China-India border. The US should recognize as legitimate those voted to leadership posts in China and the newly independent countries in free and fair elections and referendums, including reformed former CCP members, invite heads of state and parliamentary leaders for official visits to Washington within months of their taking office to empower them and their democratic system, strengthen their country's sovereignty, and facilitate bilateral relations. And finally, to further solidify the sovereignty of the new republics, the US should support their entry as member states into the UN, ASEAN, and other key regional and international organizations. And they should also be brought into regional defense alliances. So let's go through some of these autonomous regions and into special region. So with its demonstrable passion for democratic freedom, Hong Kong will undoubtedly be at the forefront of those seeking independence from China as soon as the opportunity arises. And with its recent democratic experience, high degree of human development, and vibrant economy, it's the most likely to succeed. Hong Kong has a proto-national constitution in its basic law, recent experience with a multi-party system, and a legislative and judicial infrastructure that can be reinvigorated with free and fair democratic elections, which should include those in the diaspora. The U.S. should give Hong Kong the political, legal, and diplomatic support to make the transition to independence consistent with U.S. guidelines. Then there's the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, which will undoubtedly seek independence from China at the first opportunity as well, as no bonds of trust with Beijing can exist, given the genocide it has suffered under CCP rule. Several well-organized Uyghur diaspora organizations advocate for a peaceful democratic transition. They express pride in the Turkic ethnic group's long history on the steppe of Central Asia, their millennial-old culture, and their Muslim religion. The U.S. should support Xinjiang in the determination of its future status. While Xinjiang would have numerous reasons for optimism as a free nation, it will have to overcome formidable challenges, including resentment against its large Han minority, some of whom were sent there just to oppress them, the influence of Islamist extremism across its borders. The diaspora organizations from Xinjiang in the United States and other Western nations will be a valuable resource for democratic nation building. It will need strong U.S. support. Tibet is the home to the ethnic Tibetan Buddhist community. Ethnic Tibetan communities are also found to live in various Tibetan autonomous prefectures and counties in other Chinese provinces. Small, relatively poor, and severely oppressed, Tibet will be facing two choices with the collapse of the CCP regime, in my view. One is to pursue independent sovereignty or to remain in China with strengthened greater autonomy. Most of Tibet's population of about 3.6 million people no longer speak Tibetan, and many of them are Han Chinese transplanted there under the CCP's forced assimilation policy. Authorities have removed at least 1 million Tibetan children from their families and placed them in state-run boarding schools to indoctrinate them against their Tibetan identity. Beijing is now asserting the right to validate the reincarnation of the next Dalai Lama, in the category of Ripley's Believe It or Not. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism in exile in India, has been an important voice of peace, stability, and democracy for Tibetans, and his role will be critical to the success of the region as it goes forward. He publicly declares that he rejects independence for Tibet and instead seeks meaningful autonomy, espousing a middle way policy. Whether he or his successor will continue to hold this view in the absence of the CCP pressure remains to be seen. The entire population of Tibet, including the exile community, should have the opportunity to vote democratically to determine independence. As the Dalai Lama's website declares, he established democratic governance for the Tibetan government in exile. Another important consideration is Tibet's borders. U.S. diplomats will need to help resolve whether and how to include the autonomous Tibetan prefectures and counties within the country and to deal with the border conflict with India. If there is no resolution to the border dispute, the U.S. should consider measures to reinforce Tibet's autonomy. The Tibetan Policy and Support Act, which President Trump signed into law in 2020, lays some groundwork for this and can be built upon. It establishes an official U.S. policy of the right of the Tibetan Buddhist community to select and venerate its own religious leaders, and specifies sanctions for Chinese officials who interfere in the selection of his successor. In addition, the act requires a U.S. consulate in Lhasa, and it should quickly appoint a consul in that eventuality. Inner Mongolia, the Ningxia Hui province, Both have grievances based on forced cultural assimilation policies of Beijing, and I would expect them to vote for independence as well. They and Guangxi should be supported if they do. Then there's the matter of egregious human rights violations. A few, and these are only a few examples of immediate action steps that the U.S. should ensure if the U.S. moves in there, follow. One, free all political and religious detainees, including the 9 Catholic bishops currently in secret detention, and the prisoners, all prisoners, including those held in unofficial detention places, forced labor camps, and psychiatric institutes, including Xinjiang's large re-education camp complex, and the 2,000 political prisoners in Hong Kong, including Jimmy Lai. 2, stop forced sterilizations. These are steps that can be taken immediately. Stop forced sterilizations and forced abortions in Xinjiang and elsewhere where it occurs. In both Xinjiang and Tibet, release the combined estimate of 2 million children forced into state boarding schools and reunite them with their families. In all hospitals and transplant centers, suspend organ transplant surgeries until organ donations are determined to be voluntary. Reopen houses of worship that have been shut or repurposed. Allow houses of worship and religious organizations to operate independently from patriotic associations and similar state and party organizations. End CCP indoctrination, re-education, and ensure free speech and the free flow of information, including in minority languages. Reform textbooks, which, for example, teach Xi Jinping's sayings, such as, quote, our struggle with the West is irreconcilable, and so will be even very sharp. They've got to go. So that concludes. There's a Chinese proverb that a crisis is an opportunity riding a dangerous wind, and the U.S. effort to advance freedom and justice can help make this a beneficial opportunity for all concerned. Thank you very much.
So thank you. My thanks to the Hudson Institute and to Miles for asking me. I'm a little embarrassed to be speaking here today because my subject of expertise, which is the domestic PRC legal system, the premise of this talk, of course, is that that subject has disappeared. I'm going to be talking a little bit about constitution making. Back in the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton wondered whether societies, he said, are really capable of establishing a good government from reflection or choice, or whether they are forced, whether they are destined, forever destined, to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. So today I want to say something about what we might expect from a constitution-making process following a collapse of the current political system in China. So a few caveats are in order here. First of all, what do we mean by collapse? Well, it could mean a range of things. We say that the Soviet Union collapsed, but what really happened there, of course, is that the authority of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union collapsed. The constituent republics remained in existence, and in fact, they got even, a more realistic existence than they had ever had under the Soviet Union. So there was a structure on which to build the new Russia, even though we might be a little disappointed at how it turned out. Similarly, back in China, the Qing dynasty collapsed, but the provinces retained their identity and their ability to act politically. Now, of course, modern China is not the USSR, and it's not the Qing dynasty. In particular, it has systematically suppressed all the non-governmental organizations. whether it's independent churches, labor unions, chambers of commerce, organizations like that, that might have provided resources for post-collapse political organization. Still, it seems unlikely that the loss of authority of the party center will result in utter anarchy. So some sources of authority are going to arise, even if we don't know exactly what they're going to look like. Second, we can observe developments, but I think it's very unlikely that outsiders can actually offer, practical and useful advice. There's not much that outsiders can know that the insiders, don't already know. So what exactly are we going to be telling them? What really determines the content of constitutions is really intensely local political considerations, on the ground when the Constitution is being drafted. And so, outsiders' recommendations about what you ought to include and what your constitution-making process ought to look like, I think are largely pointless. So what we can do, though, is refrain from giving bad advice, and in particular from, when we're trying to assess it, from condemning whatever results simply because, the Constitution doesn't contain our particular, pet, provisions. So, a Constitution that looks terrific is very likely to be one that everyone ignores. And so, it really is going to have to contain political compromises. Those political compromises, probably are not going to look very good if we know what was behind them. So at the same time, though, there are elements of constitution making that we can identify as more or less likely to cause problems, subject always to the caveat that every country is different and that there aren't any one-size-fits-all solutions. So let's just start with, why do you want a constitution anyways? Why might we expect the people of China to even bother with a new constitution following collapse? Well, it does seem to be something that people generally do in the wake of political upheavals, and constitutions do in fact serve several useful purposes. One, not required for international recognition, but it helps if you can have a constitution to sort of identify yourself as a real political entity. It also does serve a purpose, if well done, in securing domestic recognition from various parties within one's own state. It lays out the formal mechanisms for the exercise of public power, and in particular, I think it can memorialize, in writing, the details, of a real political bargain that was struck among influential actors. So it does seem pretty likely that people in China, will want to establish a new constitution. If we look at the history of constitution making in China, and this is something that Piero is much more familiar with than me, we can make a few observations. In general, this history is one of constitutions that were mostly ignored. So, there's plenty of blame to go around here, but I think one factor is that the various actual and proposed constitutions were typically not the subject of some kind of a real bargain among politically powerful actors. On the one hand, it might have been a constitution that was simply imposed unilaterally, or pretty unilaterally, by one actor that controlled everything throughout the process and didn't let anyone else have a say. On the other end, it might be a constitution that was largely, drafted by people who didn't have any political power, and so they were incapable of making the provisions stick. And this is really a general dilemma of constitution making. So at any given time, in any given society, there's going to be people who are powerful and people who are not. Obviously, a simple piece of paper isn't going to change that. Now, a constitution that takes no account of this power is useless because it's never going to be effective. But at the same time, a constitution that takes full account of existing power relations is also useless because it's unnecessary. It doesn't change anything. So, we're going to need to understand that in assessing any constitution-making process and its results, and again, not dismiss a constitution simply because it doesn't contain our favorite pet positions. Now, how do you get a constitution-making process started? Well, a lot depends on the extent to which the existing institutions survive, in a post-collapse China. So will the National People's Congress still exist as an institution? Well, what about the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference? Can they be used as a temporary source, at least, of authority for a new constitution? So, whatever we may think about them now, again, we have the model of the Soviet Republic, which really, didn't have much of a meaningful existence under the Soviet Union, and yet this kind of, sham existence then all of a sudden, became real when the Soviet Union collapsed. And the same for kind of the constitutions of the countries of Eastern Europe under Soviet domination. Nobody paid any attention to them while they were under Soviet domination, but then they sort of sprang to life from the dead after the Soviet Union withdrew its support from the existing regimes. And so the Eastern European experience, I think, is on the one hand both instructive and not instructive. Except in Romania, there was considerable institutional continuity in the post-communist transition. So typically, this transition took place in two phases, at least in terms of the constitutional order. So first, we had these roundtable talks under the existing political and constitutional structure between the government and the opposition. And the governments in these cases basically knew that they were on the way out. They did have some bargaining power, but the talks were basically about smoothing their exit. And so the way for the path to free elections was typically paved using the existing constitutional structure and then ratified by the existing Communist Party-controlled legislature. And then in the second phase, then, these new governments oversaw further constitutional reforms. And you saw a similar kind of process in South Africa. So could this happen in China? I think it's unlikely that it would happen in the same way. The governments of Eastern Europe depended on external military backing from the USSR. And when that disappeared, they quickly folded. And, we don't have a parallel situation to that in China. So we're unlikely to see this kind of bargaining, I think, between a government and its opposition that we saw, for example, in Poland and Czechoslovakia. So institutionally speaking, the question is whether constitutional reform is going to be carried out within the framework of existing institutions or kind of in an institutional vacuum. Now, the last time China saw a complete collapse of central government authority was, I would put it in 1911 when the Qing dynasty fell. I don't count 1949 as a collapse because, the KMT left, but the CCP came right in, and so we didn't see a complete collapse of central authority. But at the time when the Qing dynasty fell, there was a robust civil society. So, the Qing itself had this history of ruling with a light hand and depending a lot on local elites, and these local elites played a large role in late Qing reforms, and they were a resource that could be drawn on in constitution making. But as we know, those conditions don't exist in China today. The CCP, nobody would say that they rule with a light hand, and they have, of course, suppressed all kinds of independent civil society organizations. So it's hard to see civil society organizations such as Solidarity or the Catholic Church, in the case of Poland, playing much of a role as a substitute for collapsed political institutions if those institutions do indeed collapse. Now, whatever happens, the question of legitimacy is key. And we can break this down into a few components. We can call that upstream legitimacy, process legitimacy, and downstream legitimacy. So by upstream legitimacy, I mean, how do we assemble a group to draft a new constitution? What is our constitutional assembly, let's call it a constituent assembly? What is that going to look like? How will it be assembled? And according to what principles? Now, given our premise of collapse, that's the premise of this whole, session today, it may be that there is no body, with the political authority to make these kinds of decisions, unchallenged. So it seems likely here that the parties to any bargain, again, if we are assuming as a premise kind of the collapse of central authority, it seems that the parties to any bargain about a constitutional assembly, are going to be regional authorities. Whether, whoever is in control of the various provinces, unless we really mean by collapse something like, utter chaos and anarchy, which again, I don't think is likely to happen. But if we're looking to regional authorities, then I think it's going to be asking too much, to expect a lot of kind of legitimacy here. The provincial authority may be the local party boss. So I think some recognition of political reality is going to be necessary here. But a constitution can still gain legitimacy in other ways. So the second kind of legitimacy would be process legitimacy. So here we're going to ask, how is this drafting process going to work? Is it going to take place under the shadows, of a gun? Is it going to take place under the shadows of, mass, demonstrations? And so in this case, for example, if we were giving advice that someone was willing to listen to, we might say, let's not have it located in the capital city. Let's not have it located in any major city at all. Let's have it, out in the boondocks somewhere, so that nobody will be able to mobilize mass demonstrations to try to intimidate the delegates. Is voting going to be by some method that weighs population, or if the Constituent Assembly is put together by regional authorities, are people going to insist that every region get a vote, kind of, like our Senate works, or is it going to work like, our House of Representatives works? That's another question that constitutional assemblies have to deal with. And then how much public involvement is the right amount? The U.S. Constitution, was drafted by a small group in secret. Is that going to work in the 20th century? The 21st century? Perhaps not. But, there's a lot of problems with an open and transparent process. In particular, it makes it hard to make the kinds of sometimes dirty and messy, at least political compromises that are necessary to make a constitution successful. And a reliable, a realistic and effective new constitution for China is going to involve, some kind of messy and ugly political deals. And so again, I think it would be a mistake to demand too much by way of transparency if as outsiders we're trying to assess and, evaluate the process. And then finally, we get downstream legitimacy. So this is about ratification. So, even if voters are given, for example, who's going to be the ratifying body? Is it going to be, every citizen of China? What are the borders of China in that case? So there are questions that need to be answered here, but so how they are answered is going to affect the legitimacy, the perceived legitimacy of the ratification process. It basically involves just giving voters a take it or leave it choice, but that is not, that's not meaningless. In the year 2000, the voters in Zimbabwe rejected by a 54 to 46% vote a constitution that had been drafted in a process that looked consultative, but as we might expect, had been in fact controlled by Robert Mugabe. And then finally, how are we going to judge the result? Well, I mentioned earlier it's unlikely that outsiders can have a significant impact on the process for making the Constitution or for its substance. With the possible exception of some very technical drafting tips, how to resolve perhaps some logical contradictions in the document. But again, we can't go too far there because some of the logical contradictions may be the product of this political deal, and everybody decided, let's live with the contradiction, and we'll just, kick that can down the road and let a constitutional court work it out, for example, 20 years later. But, outsiders will be called upon to pass judgment on the new constitution, possibly in the context of requests for, military, financial, diplomatic, or just moral support. So I think the key here, is to be realistic and not to expect too much. So legal scholar Mark Tushnet, who is an expert on constitution making, has written, whether a constitutional provision has life on the ground depends not on what the Constitution's text guarantees, but rather, on whether the political forces in the society are arrayed in a way that gives politically significant figures an interest in ensuring that the rights, in this Constitution are respected. And I think that's very wise. So any Constitution that's going to last is going to have to deal with political realities. And I think the locals will know those political realities better than outsiders will. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Okay, now we have a panel discussion, and I'm told that we can go beyond the original schedule, 12 o'clock mark. Okay, great. Okay, panelists, please. All right, thank you for these excellent presentations, and as expected, I mean, they were really brilliant. Let me just go by the order of the presentations. My first question goes to Piero. You mentioned about the past is product, definitely, and there are a lot of similarities of the legalistic tradition and the communist Leninist regime. One of the things that's really striking me that's really is amazing is the concept of hierarchy. The traditional society, Chinese society, is all ranked by all kinds of, everybody should know his or her place. Hierarchy is the social fabricate, the core of the Chinese society. China is obsessed with harmony, stability. And in today's China, of course, the communism, even though it's professed to be a champion for equality, but China is fundamentally very hierarchical. You mentioned about the hukou, the household registration. Now, what to know about hukou is hereditary. It's very fengjian. It's very feudal, right? And of course, if you live in the Chinese society, you should be really aware, and you're meant to be aware where you are, which level you are, what GBA you are, right? Because which GBA you belong to, which level you belong to, which hierarchy you are, determines a lot of things, right? So in this case, how do we then instill the idea of equality? I mean, the fundamental founding creed of this nation is that all men are created equal. So that actually is a very powerful signal to the Chinese citizens. I remember there was one very important thing in 1990s when President Bill Clinton, went to China, and he and his young daughter Chelsea walk on the street of Shanghai in the motorcade, and then finally Chelsea wanted to have ice cream, Chinese ice cream. So they walk out of the limousine, and Bill Clinton, the President of the United States, held a hand with his daughter and went to the ice cream shop and bought ice cream. Bill Clinton put out the wallet and paid for it. That, to the ordinary Chinese citizen, is unimaginable. It was at that moment that the idea of equality is worth probably several hours of speech. Right? So it's very, very powerful. So how would you recommend?
Well, I think, yes, hierarchy is very strong, and it does exist in not just the legalist tradition, in the Confucian tradition, but I think in that Confucian tradition there is also a ameliorating and a more equal tradition. So, for example, the notion of the examination system.
That's right.
And merit. In theory, anyone from the lowest social strata could take the examination and rise to the highest levels. I think there is in Mencian Confucianism, the Mencius in particular, there is a much more egalitarian strain. Mencius's hierarchy of, who comes first, it's the people come first. Then the grains and altars, the functions of governance of the state, and last comes the emperor. So even though there is this strong hierarchical tradition, there is a tension there, and there's an indigenous tension. I think you also then do have the example of Taiwan, and how does the Chinese, now Taiwanese will say, well, we have a separate Taiwanese identity, but it still is very much a Chinese culture, and I think that notion and Chinese republicanism and Sun Yat-sen, there is that tradition as well. So I think there is a influence, partially that comes from Taiwan. There is an indigenous tradition that can be drawn upon, and then there's outside influence too, and you do have Western influence as well. For example, feminism and some of the feminist movements too. That also, I think, you see that as well. Some of these notions. So I think there's enough influences both from within, from the near without, and then from beyond to kind of, I think, shape a more egalitarian consciousness. One thing, though, I would, I think, caution, and it's very easy to think of sort of China as a whole and the assumption that it will continue as a whole, but I do think that this the centrifugal forces also are very strong, and what may be true in Guangdong, where you might see a more liberal strain emerge post-collapse, might not be true in Beijing or Tianjin. Mm-hmm. So I think that's it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer.
Yeah, talk about the imperial examination. That was definitely a very good tradition, right? Equalizes this unbearable burden of hierarchy, because everybody is, in theory, supposed to have a chance to make it. Today in China, Gaokao followed that tradition. Gaokao is basically China's examination hell. So I personally went through that myself. But even that mechanism actually could, which has indeed served as some kind of social safety valve for China. Even that has some kind of is corrupted, degenerated. You have this, recruits, college recruits, basically through examination, Gaokao, and also you have recommendation. Right. It is in that category, and it also regional difference over there. The thresholds for being admitted into colleges are vastly different regions. Right. Beijing, Tianjin, and in Ningxia, Xinjiang, and they're very different. So there's a lot of inequalities over there too. But I get your point over there. Now, several of you mentioned about this issue of regionalism. William, I mean, in your case, you also talk about regionalism. When you greet somebody in China, the first thing is which province are you from? So that obviously has been sort of mitigated by the sort of centralization of several decades in China. But it is a very big tradition, right? It's still there. I mean, right now you have an independent movement. We know about independence movement from Xinjiang, from Tibet. I mean, New York City, there is a Shanghai Independence Party, right? There is also the emergence of the Manchurian independence movement going on. They're actually beginning to print, Manchurian citizenship cards to people. That's very interesting. So in the year 1900, that's the year of the Boxer Rebellion, when the Chinese Qing dynasty declared war on the world, and several provinces in the south declared autonomy, independence. So do you see this kind of emergence of regionalism that is obviously very, very nascent? It's probably invisible in every case. Could be potentially a force for good.
Wow, Miles, you asked the easy questions. No, that's a very good question. I think it is complicated by the fact that, as you said, since 1949, I think the government has put such an emphasis on kind of a national consciousness of promoting Mandarin. For example, if you live in Shanghai, you could see elderly grandparents speaking Shanghaise to their children who are answering back in crystal clear Mandarin. So over time, what has that done to weaken regionalism? my assumption would be that it's actually weakened it quite a bit. However, from the point of view of truth and reconciliation commissions, I think it's still important to potentially have regional or local responses, because there have probably been such amazingly different amounts of repression in different places. Where in Guangdong, potentially there's considerably less, given that it's relatively liberal and has had the strong Hong Kong influences over time, compared to other areas where they've had to use much more coercion. So that's kind of where I was trying to get at in my remarks regarding why it would be useful to not just have a very high-level response, which I think would be important to look at all of the political atrocities over time, but then to actually have some dialogue and truth-telling at the local level, where, if we look at, the Rwanda example, they also divided into 3 different layers, where there was the kind of the international, criminal tribunal, the national court system, and then very local committees to talk about things on a more reconciliation model. So although I think I don't know to what extent international models could be useful, I think that having that tiered system could potentially be one way forward for China.
Okay, great. Nina, I find your remarks fascinating, because you brought something that I never thought about. Inner Mongolia joining Outer Mongolia to become an independent state, and Fujian province joining Taiwan. And that's just a really, really interesting and a fascinating idea. Now,
I'm not sure it would work, though. I'm not sure they want it.
Well, I think this is all about possibilities. We don't know
These
whether
are
it works or not.
possibilities.
But it's all the idea. That's where, because a lot of people in China do think about this kind of things. Now, you also brought up the Eastern and European experience and the Soviet experience, which is a relatively sort of blunt list, right? So that's because you have some figures like Yeltsin who there say, listen, you want to go, you go, and then they do have some kind of a unique ethnic identity of all these republics, which is brings me to thinking about the former president of Taiwan, who is the father of Taiwan democracy, Li Denghui. Now, Li Denghui had this very interesting idea. Hey, China is too big. We got to divide them into 7 parts. 7 parts: Manchuria, Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, and then Hong Kong, Macau 1, and Taiwan. So all of them together. Rather than disintegration, Nina, the question for you is, would it be possible to have some kind of a federation of states? In other words, they have a total autonomy, but then they remain within the sort of framework of one country. It's kind of a United States of China.
I think that may be a solution for a core group of them that is mainland China right now. But I think that the forcible assimilation policies of the CCP for those ethnic areas has poisoned this whole notion of autonomy. Hong Kong is not going to want to have any kind of part of this. I think that they'll want to go on their own. And I think that they will all want to leave. We saw that in Eastern Europe and the Soviet republics, where the communist leaders wanted to break away at that point. They wanted to be the warlords of their areas, or the next democratic president, as the case may be. But so I expect them to want to, that they don't quite have this nationalist feeling. They don't share maybe an ideal that America has, our ideals of democracy and rights and freedoms they don't share that with each other. I don't really know, and it's going to be up to them, and we're not going to be able to stop them racing to the exits, nor are we going to be able to say that you should join this group or that group. Yeah. But what we can do is say, we will shore up your legitimacy, and we will support you in defense or trade or in other ways if you meet certain conditions that we set out. Now, George H.W.'s administration, Bush's administration's list of guidelines may be good, or the president current president may want to add other ones, take away some. So we don't know what those principles are. That should be step one. The United States should have right now in its vest pocket are those principles, and then we should offer our support for their sovereignty and recognizing their legitimacy and bringing them to UN if they meet those criteria.
Yeah, that's absolutely the core of the issue, right? It's up to them.
It's up to them.
It's not to us.
Yeah.
Which is basically what Canadians did dealing with the Quebec, and how the people in Gibraltar dealing with their own status used through vote, and how the people in Spain dealing with the Basque movement, right? So basically, it is a popular sovereignty. You have to go through that process either way.
We can try to anticipate what they will do, and I think that it's going to be. I think some of these places, like the Republic of Mongolia, which is very small, the most sparsely populated nation on our earth, I think, 3 million people, they're going to. I think they're proud of their freedom, and they may fear Inner Mongolia, which is, orders of magnitude larger, with no experience of democracy. They may feel that they don't want that. So,
or they may.
So we can anticipate that. I would anticipate that they wouldn't want that, but maybe they'd want it.
Yeah, that's right. Which is really good segue to what Don's remarks.
Can I just add a little more?
Please,
to it? Yeah. So I want to sort of endorse the idea that China's nationalities policy over the last, say, 15 years really has poisoned kind of the possibilities of what easily could have happened. Because I was in China in the late 70s as a student. And, knew some Uyghur students there. And, they thought they were cooler than the Han students. But, they weren't complaining about, the jackboot of oppression or something, or saying how they're dying to be, independent of the rest of China. And, that attitude could have persisted till today, if it had not been for this, terrible, change in nationalities policy that we've seen.
Yeah.
And Uyghurs might have looked around today and said, would we rather be a part of a democratic, pretty rich China, or do we want to become another Central Asian stan? And the first option would be much more attractive to a lot of people, certainly. So it's by no means, a foregone conclusion that everybody, every Uyghur is dying for independence from China, except that we've got this terrible policy.
Oh, you're right.
You don't want to be part of a state that has been genociding you for the last.
Yeah, and it's been so heavy-handed there with the forced sterilizations, the demographic manipulation, and also this fake relative program that our colleague Nori Turko writes about.
It's not just the centralization of policy.
Yeah.
For many, many years, I think people were sort of poisoned or indoctrinated, whatever you call it, by the idea that somehow a grand unification is better than independence over there, right? China cannot afford being independent, autonomous. Otherwise, it's going to be chaos. So that idea I think, is really bad. The whole issue is about who should decide their own status, right? Their own fate. So that goes with the Tibetans and the Uyghurs. I mean, to be honest with you, with the most of Han Chinese as well. I mean, they do have their own unique economic and even linguistic differences. I mean, I think that personally, to me, the difference between my dialect and the Cantonese is much bigger than the difference between my dialect and the English, for example. So it's a very unique. Now, Don, you mentioned something very interesting. Is that we cannot really impose a constitution from outside. You mentioned about the very important issue, outsider and insider issue. I think that's important. It's important. However, just to learn from you as a contrarian, constructively, the issue, seems to me, is not external or internal. The issue is whether there is something universal. Now, we haven't talked about this, about how the regime is going to collapse, right? But the one possibility even how it might be very distant, but think about it's not. One distant possibility of regime collapse is because U.S. and China getting into war, right? And China has been defeated. And then we have the situation like Japan. When Japan was defeated, what did we do? We gave them a constitution. We wrote the constitution. MacArthur gave it to the Japanese, like it or not. They ratify it, right? So there is a possibility that, because that's universal ideas, the Japanese embrace it, even to this day. They hold onto their constitution more seriously than we do, right? So in the case, so what I'm saying is, it's a possibility. Yes, there are some lousy foreigners give bad advice to China in throughout history. Frank Goodenough, for example, he wanted Yuan Shikai to be the emperor, and General Stilwell, for example, it's terrible ideas, right? But you do have some kind of something universal that I think as American we have something universal to give to the rest of the world, and I think a lot of people in China would love to have some kind of a constitution. Doesn't matter who wrote it, who gave it to them, or what happened, and that they will have an opportunity to ratify, or reject, or accept it. So my question to you is, I'm not trying to repudiate what you say, but I'm saying is, in the scenario of the collapse, which I think very interesting, I watched Justice Neil Gorsuch on C-SPAN the other day. He said something very interesting. He was asking, what do you think is the most beautiful part of the American Constitution? Is our constitution the best in the world? And he said, well, I have read some constitutions from Soviet Union, from China, North Korea. They're beautiful. I mean, they're not fake. It's a freedom of expression. Everything's there. We want it much better than what we have. But the difference is they don't mean anything because they don't have the separation of powers. Power is concentrated. That's what the CCP is all about. They monopolize power. So once you have a monopoly of power, nothing will work. So, but this is a scenario where we don't have a monopoly of power. So in other words, anything will go as long as the people agree to it. So I'm asking you, do you agree with what I said?
I'm sorry,
Never mind.
What's the specific question?
The specific question is, in other words, I don't think it should matter if there is an external or internal constitution. As long as there is a fair way to have a constitution, either written by the 50 people, in the Independence Hall behind the door, or not. But the question was we have some kind of draft that people will decide.
Yeah.
So from your remarks, I sense the idea that you reject the idea somehow outsiders should not get involved, also should be totally transparent.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is, so I have, what the Constitution eventually looks like, right? If someone says, oh, you got that idea from foreigners, I think that's a stupid criticism, right? It doesn't matter where the ideas come from. The point is, are they good ideas, right? Yeah. And then the second thing is, are they going to work, in China? So if you're talking specifically about separation of powers, that seems to be an idea that works generally well, right, in constitutions. And so, if I'm evaluating the Constitution that comes out of whatever Constitution drafting process occurs, I'm going to say, I think that's probably a good idea. And as you say, the ratification process is also very important. So there's got to be some process, whether it's the drafting process, whether it's the constituent assembly process, or whether it's the ratification process, that gives it a kind of political legitimacy. So sure. I mean, if we put it to the body of Chinese voters, and they all approve at 90%, then that's a great source of genuine political legitimacy.
Right. Piero, you want to add?
Yeah. I think it's important to point out that the notion of universal values also exists in the Chinese tradition. The Chinese Communist Party, document number 9, 2012, that rejects universal values as a Western imposition, is wrong. I mean, you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There was a Chinese contribution to that, P.C. Chang. I mean, so you have essentially Confucian values that are also incorporated and present in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When Li Keqiang basically his final speech when he retired from public life, he made this statement that men act and heaven watches, ren zai gan, tian zai kan. And that probably is what got him in trouble with Xi Jinping, because he is making an appeal to universal values there by which you can judge the actions of men, in particular one man. And that has resonance, again, with this Confucian tradition that Mencius cites, heaven sees with the eyes of the people and hears with the ears of the people there. So there is a lot of commonality. And when you look at that, the Constitution of the Republic of China with its 5 branches, yes, you have separation of power there, and you do have a drawing upon not just the Western tradition, acknowledgement of a Western influence, but also those 2 extra branches, drawing again from a indigenous constitutionalism, one that existed in the imperial system, a check and balance against imperial power that the scholar class represented.
A very good friend of mine said very famously that Chinese communism is communism. The irony here is that communism is not only Western, and communism also believes that it's a universal value.
Yeah.
So, anyway, so we have time for a couple questions. Let's go over there first, and then, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for a great conference. I'm Dan Tobin with National Intelligence University, but I have to offer the caveat that I'm speaking just on my own behalf, not any part of the U.S. government. I wanted to pull on a thread that William was offering, but open the question, to the broader group, and that is that you mentioned national rejuvenation, which is very much, I think, a very deep-seated, both Chinese elite and maybe broader aspiration that the party tries to monopolize, and they very much want people to believe only the party can achieve national rejuvenation. But it seems like if we kind of move the conversation to what could the U.S. do to prepare the ground in the meantime, being able to cast a vision for national rejuvenation that's not the Leninist one that's being offered, and that's not the sort of deleterious one in the international community, but offering one that is rooted in China's tradition, that seems like that would be a useful project. And I'm cognizant that it's not clear that the U.S. government, either in the prior or current administration, is likely to be doing this. But if you could sort of blank sheet of paper, either kind of how do you think if you were in a different context of a U.S. administration that was interested in this, how would you do it, and or what would some of the pieces of that vision of national rejuvenation, rooted in the Chinese tradition but not the CCP's vision, be? So that's kind of a broad question, but thank you.
William, go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to get at, is that I think that is a slogan by Xi Jinping used for coercive means domestically and power projection internationally, but actually has deep resonance with people. And I think that we could pull on that. I mean, is it, for example, I've talked with Uyghur friends, a friend, Rayhan Assat, her brother Ekbar, he's been detained in solitary confinement for years. Is it part of, can you be a great nation if you are putting people in solitary confinement for nothing? I mean, and if we're able to appeal to China and say that if it really wants international respect, it needs to live up to its own human rights commitments that it has signed. So I think that could be a very bare minimum ask, that, and a way of reframing it, that I think the Chinese government would have really no way to not at least engage with.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that too, because I also reference that as well. And the response to the Chinese people's, to Xi Jinping's call is, that the laying flat. So it's a form of passive resistance. And you spoke about Confucianism and legalism, but there is another Chinese tradition, Taoism, and that principle of Wu Wei. When the state is repressive, instead of meeting that force, you just give way. And I think what we're seeing now is that giving way, that laying flat there. But inherent in that idea is when that oppressive force, that overwhelming force has expended itself, there is that springing back too. So I think there is these sort of indigenous reserves. We've seen this before in Chinese history too, where there is it's almost this sort of Taoist Wu Wei principle. So I think there is hope for a rejuvenation that is organic and indigenous, but it is one that rejects the heavy imposition of the Chinese Communist Party.
I think rejuvenation is, first of all, cliches should be avoided, but good cliches need to be repeated. One of the good ones is that Samuel Johnson said, nationalism is the last refuge of scoundrels. Here again, there's nothing more sensitive than the pronunciation that the Chinese Communist Party does not represent Chinese people. They go crazy when you mention anything close to that. So that's what I'm saying. When they talk about national rejuvenation, it's not really about Chinese people. I mean, Pierre talk about Tangping, lying flat. People don't care about this, apathetic to this kind of appeal. Because what he was really talking about, the national rejuvenation, is Chinese Communist Party's rejuvenation, rise to hegemony. So, anyway, yeah. Oh,
good. Yeah.
Okay, let's go with the question over there. Yeah, and then you.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question again.
You seem to be surprised.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not gonna waste time to do another self-introduction, but what I'm really curious. So obviously, when it comes to like China turning from an autocracy to a democracy, people based in Xinjiang, people based in Tibet or in Hong Kong, they will obviously be acceptive of that idea and they will welcome that idea. But in most public opinion polls, especially recently with CCP, actually a lot of people do support the Chinese Communist Party in China. At the high end is like 80 to 90%, but obviously that's a fake number. There's no government in the world that gets 80 to 90% of support. So in the scenario where the Chinese government went from a full-on autocracy to a democracy, which hopefully that is the case, how should we expect the broader Chinese people, especially based in the Han ethnicity, accept that transition and that change? Thank you.
So let me just take on that because I know a little bit about that. You say 80 to 90% of Chinese people agree with the Communist Party. That's not good enough. In North Korea, it's 100%. The actual one is a survey done by Harvard University. It's a Kennedy School of Guanxi, right? So there is an Ash Center. The Chinese Communist Party pay a lot of money to that institution. So what they did was they conducted several years of survey inside China. And the conclusion was that something like 93% of people all agree they support the Chinese Communist Party. So this lie has been repeatedly cited by the Chinese government, including the spokesperson, year after year. What happened is the Harvard University never conducted their own survey in China because nobody can really conduct a genuine survey. Harvard University subcontract a firm called Horizon Research Group in Beijing. It's a Chinese firm to conduct the so-called survey. Of course, the result is obvious. In China, you cannot even say Xi Jinping is a jerk. I mean, that's a crime. So I mean, in this environment where there's no freedom of expression, all surveys were not avoid from the beginning. So that's basically answer the question. Yeah.
Winnie the Pooh is a jerk.
There you go. You can say here in the free country, yeah, but not in China. So
can I add something to that? So yeah, there is not freedom of speech, but I think the real issue with these surveys is that there's not freedom of information. So in other words, if the question is the Chinese Communist Party doing a good job, then relying on these surveys is crazy, right? But if the question is, does the average Chinese citizen think that they are groaning under the jackboot of dictatorship, then the answer is they probably don't. However, that is because they're not getting good information. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, that you could genuinely say that perhaps there is 80 or 90% level of support, but it's fragile. And if it were exposed to new information, about soil pollution, food safety issues, corruption issues, revealing all the assets of top party leaders, then that support would probably drop extremely quickly.
And
so I think the issue is information.
I would just add that I think that from what I've seen in the past, sometimes there's also the methodological problem where people may say the central government has a high level of support, but the local government wouldn't. And that's because of by design, where all the problems are placed on the local government, and the central government is always this kind of savior who comes in to rectify the mistakes. So if people were given better information on those surveys, then I think maybe the results would be different. But also, I mean, how could there be more support? I mean, we're just kind of brainstorming, but I think that if there was an economic model, as kind of people like Michael Pettis are always talking about, where there needs to be more of a consumption-based model, there's the hukou reforms potentially, and more support for social services, things that people really care about in terms of the retirement benefits, the 5 pensions, which are generally, there's a huge looming crisis on those. If a democratic government were able to support those things more, you could potentially see how a democracy could maybe gain support through economic legitimacy as well.
I think in China, if you don't read the news, you are uninformed. If you do read the news, you are misinformed. Okay. So news information. I don't think right now getting information is not the issue. The issue is the consequence of telling truth, and there's a genuine fear. Can you imagine you go to China, somebody asks you, do you support the Chinese Communist Party's policies? Okay, so even if you say no, if you think no, I mean, you might think if I say no, can I trust this guy? How am I going to get by if somebody knocks on my door? So, in other words, in the totalitarian regime, in the information control environment, there will be no genuine survey results because there's a lack of fidelity. So that's what I'm saying. The response is very different. You can have the accurate survey result only in the country where freedom of expression is 100% guaranteed. So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I just want to point out that that dropping out is a response. It's a non-response response, and that when you have that across the society, when you have a 996 economy where people just say, "What's the point?" Where you have not just even, we talk about prison labor and Uyghur forced labor, but even people with college degrees it's like they're running in place on a treadmill and they're not making progress. So there is this movement towards just saying meh, and that's a response, even if it's a response.
996, by the way, is the Chinese working schedule from 9 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the evening, 6 days a week.
Dave Ansbach, no affiliation. I just want to, can a case be made that the Chinese government and party is really not a true communist government, but actually a fascist government in disguise? Because it combines, of course, the authoritarian repression and the nativism and nationalism that's known in fascism with allowing private enterprise as long as it does the government's bidding, compared to a true communist government like Cuba where they completely control the government completely controls the means of production. I was just wondering if you have thought that way too. Thanks.
I can answer. I don't agree because it's not in disguise. So, it's all the things you mentioned plus the goose stepping of the military.
Right.
So, so other than your statement that it was in disguise,
so basically, you say
it's not well disguised.
It's a fascist government more than a communist one. Is that right?
I don't
think
it
doesn't seem very communist. Xi Jinping inveighs against welfareism, which makes people lazy. It has a higher Gini coefficient than I believe the United States.
There is a core identity. There is also a tactical methods. I think in the regime is basically the communism in a way. I mean, that doesn't include it from being fascist in methods, right? So if you look, one of the things that if you read communism, you understand the doctrines, you understand basic tenets of communism. China fits perfectly well. I mean, so it's a Marxist-Leninist there. I mean, you go to China, you go to China, say people say what's really guiding China right now is the 4 cardinal principles, right? 4个坚持，4项基本原则. This is basically the true everywhere. I mean, the most important thing is China must have 4 things, right? Socialism, which is basically public ownership of all the means of production, use that words, and then Marxism-Leninism, too, and the leadership, monopoly power by the Communist Party, and of course, proletariat, dictatorship of proletariat. So that means all the repressive, that's the fascist side of this regime. That's all the tools of repression, right? So I think, it's a fundamentally Marxist-Leninist regime armed with fascist methodologies and approaches.
Just one thing. I mean, I think we juxtapose fascism and communism as left and right, and that's sort of. I mean, that dates back to the Soviet Union. This juxtaposition, but fascism in many ways is an ideology of the left. I mean, certainly true with National Socialism. Mussolini's fascism, or the Falange in Spain, had ideas of state corporatism, and I think some of that you see in China too, with these, basically the state-owned enterprises or PLA-owned enterprises. So that would be a more purely fascistic element. But fascism and communism in many ways are children of the same mother, but they are they siblings who fight. So, but I don't think that that communist concept of fascism as being the opposite of polar opposite of communism is correct.
So we're going way beyond time. This is a big topic, and we just hope that this is the beginning of the long conversation. Get ready for the scenario of the communist regime collapse. Right? This may be a problem of hope, but also maybe a problem of reality. At some point, totalitarian regimes cracks no prior warning, so you never know. Again, look for our publication, and the title of this report from the China Center in Hudson is called "China After Communism: Preparing for the Post-CCP China," and it's also available online in digital format. And I'd like to thank the panelists again. I mean, doing a fantastic job. And also, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my deputy, Colin Tessier K, who is the office manager of China Center. He's done a fantastic job. Without him, this would not be possible. So thank you for coming. And again, thank you for your attention to this matter.
Welcome to Uncommon.